Rome was one of the most powerful, magnificent, and influential empires history has ever seen. With its majestic structures that still stand today, its military and political system that virtually turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake, its law, art, and architecture, Rome continues to maintain its importance even in our present day. However, when we look at the history of this state, we do not merely see these achievements. A bloody foundation story, endless struggles for power, assassinations, wars, slave rebellions, and uprisings. This is a massive story swinging between order and chaos for nearly 1,200 years. Now, grab your tea or coffee and lean back, because today we will discover how one of the most magnificent empires in history rose and fell. Our first stop is Italy. We need to take a brief look at the story of Rome's foundation. The bronze statue you see was made by Antonio del Pollaiolo in the 15th century. Today, it continues to be displayed on Capitol Hill in Rome and holds the distinction of being the most copied work of art in Rome. Many postcards, magnets, and ashtrays feature this image. In fact, even when you look at the emblem of the Rome football team today, you will still see the figure of a she-wolf suckling these two brothers. These are Remus and Romulus, the two brothers who founded Rome. Now let me briefly tell you their story. It might sound a bit complex, but we need to go over a short summary to understand the essence of the matter. In Italy, there is a city considered to be the sister city of Rome, yet older than Rome itself, Alba Longa. Numitor, the legitimate king of this city, is dethroned one day by his brother Amulius. Numitor's sons are killed, and his daughter, Rhea Silvia, is forced to become a Vestal virgin who takes a vow of chastity and is forbidden to bear children. In this way, Numitor's lineage would end, and Amulius's power would be secured. However, this plan fails, and Rhea Silvia becomes pregnant one day, giving birth to twin boys. Myth tells us that the father of these children was the god Mars. Amulius disregards this and orders them to be killed. The children are placed inside a basket and thrown into the Tiber River. However, they are found and suckled by a she-wolf. The story sounds familiar to us in many ways, doesn't it? Especially the part where they are left in a river in a basket, or their protection by a wolf. We can see these themes in many religious or mythological narratives. But our topic today is not strictly these elements. Our topic is what actually found and suckled Remus and Romulus. In the continuation of the myth, the two brothers are found by a shepherd named Faustulus, who brings the children home to his wife, Acca Larentia. From then on, this woman begins to nurse the children. At this point, matters begin to get complicated because in different versions of the myth, this woman is described both as a faithful housewife to her husband and as a sex worker. We encounter a word used by Roman writers, lupa. This word has two meanings in Latin. The first is she-wolf, and the second is a sex worker. What does this mean? Was the she-wolf in the story actually a sex worker? The historian Plutarch explicitly questioned this matter. Some ancient sources asserted that the figure nursing the children was not a wolf, but a sex worker. According to modern researchers, this situation is a reflection of the multi-layered relationship Rome built with itself. Rome did not derive its legitimacy from Zeus or pure divine lineage. It was born from mud, exile, and exclusion, and instead of hiding this in shame, it placed it right at the center of its foundation myth. The historian Titus Livius, in his work Ab Urbe Condita, meaning from the founding of the city, evaluates this situation as follows. What matters is not how the city was founded, but what happened after it was founded. Yes, now we need to leave the she-wolf behind, return to the story, and look at how the city was established. After the twins grow up, they return to Alba Longa, restore their grandfather, King Numitor, to the throne, and depart from there to establish their own city. They find a place for themselves on the banks of the Tiber River. However, there is a problem. Who will rule this newly established city? In one section of the myth, Romulus draws a boundary in the middle of the city and tells Remus and his men not to cross this boundary. But Remus mocks him and jumps over the boundary. Romulus becomes furious at this and kills his brother with his own hands. Thus, Rome was founded as a result of fratricide. When Roman historians spoke of this part of the myth, they adopted very different narratives. For instance, Cicero hardly wants to speak about it at all. He avoids addressing the issue of fratricide directly. While glorifying Romulus in his writings on the founding of the city, he almost ignores Remus. Livy displays a more honest but colder attitude. He relates the event, but adds no commentary. Plutarch, on the other hand, asks whether someone else might have killed Remus, because, according to some accounts, Remus was killed by Romulus's men. So, what does this part of the myth tell us? Is this a simple matter of fratricide, or is there a deeper symbolic detail beneath it? In almost every empire, the supreme importance of the state was prioritized. This was also the case in Rome. The boundary drawn by Romulus represented the traditions, law, and statutes of the state, rather than a physical wall. Even if a person were king, they could not break these rules. The punishment for doing so, no matter who it was death. Even the group that assassinated the famous Roman statesman Caesar in 44 before Christ defined themselves as a handful of men restraining Remus. In other words, even though centuries had passed since the myth, the spirit it carried continued to live within the Roman Republic. Now we have reached one of the most crucial points of the myth. This section actually explains the title of our video. Now I want to show you another photograph. The sculpture you see now was created towards the end of the 16th century by the sculptor and architect Giambologna. When you examine the sculpture roughly, we see a bewildered woman at the top, a young man abducting her in the middle, and an older man watching them helplessly below. This is the 16th century reinterpretation of the most controversial myth in the founding of Rome, namely the abduction of the Sabine women. And this story is actually the harshest and most ruthless part of the myth. Yes, Romulus had founded his new city and eliminated his brother and rival. He could now rule alone. However, there was a problem. The city did not have a sufficient population. Therefore, Romulus sent word everywhere and declared that all refugees would be accepted into the city of Rome. In theory, this was a clever move, but in practice, the city suddenly began to fill with looters, rabble, and thieves. There were almost no women among them. Can you imagine what kind of problem this was? A city full of men. But the main issue was ensuring the continuity of future generations, and for this, the Romans needed women. That is why Romulus contacted nearby tribes, especially the Sabines located northeast of Rome, and asked for their daughters. However, the Sabine tribal leaders refused to give their daughters. Thereupon, Romulus devised a plan and invited the Sabine tribe to a festival he organized. Later in the festival, the Romans snatched and abducted the young women they could find. There is a word used by Latin historians to define this event, raptus or raptio. This word carries various meanings, such as forcible detention or abduction. But it has another meaning, rape. For this reason, historians in both ancient and modern times have debated this topic deeply. The historian Livy, while relating the event, emphasizes that Romulus consoled the women, treated them well, and that they were loved and respected by their husbands. Plutarch asks more critical questions. How many women were abducted? Did they all marry? Were they taken by force? Historians have put forward figures with immense discrepancies regarding the number of abducted women, ranging between 30 and 680. We will understand better in a moment that these numbers are not actually that important. For this, we need to take a brief look at another part of the myth. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, never forgets this humiliation done to him and eventually declares war on the Romans. During the war, the Sabines advance all the way to the city of Rome. However, as depicted in the paintings you see on screen, the women suddenly jump between the two sides and stop the war. Yes, they say, "You are our fathers," but now they are our husbands. After this, peace is achieved between the two sides, and the Sabines join Rome. Now we are slowly approaching the end. We need to ask these critical questions right now. What does this story actually tell us? Did this abduction or rape event really happen? Here is another important question. How did the Romans manage to take such a myth out of being a dark part of their history and wear it like armor? If we look at this myth superficially, we see this. We can say this story tells us the legitimation of male dominance. If a man wants, he abducts by force, but even if he does this, he is right at the end of the day. The woman, on the other hand, has to accept the position she has fallen into. Even if she does not want to, she must yield to her fate. Let us remember Zeus, the famous god of Greek mythology. For example, Zeus rapes many women, and there are even goddesses among them. But in the end, nothing happens to Zeus. Even if his wife Hera is jealous of him, she directs her anger not at Zeus, but at the women he was with or raped. These are also myths constructed to legitimize the male-dominated Greek aristocracy. When we address the abduction of the Sabine women superficially here, we might think we see a similar construction. But both Roman and modern historians suggest that there is actually much more beneath this story. Those familiar with Roman history know very well how Rome grew. Rome does not come from a single ethnic background. It grows by swallowing its neighbors. It does not do this merely with the sword either. It does it through assimilation, marriage, and a shared identity. When you look closely at this story, you see this. The Sabines come to conquer Rome, but in the end they turn into a population swallowed by Rome. In later periods of Rome, when Emperor Claudius allowed senators to be chosen from Gaul, he used this exact argument and said, "Our ancestors made the Sabines citizens. We can make other citizens too." In fact, probably Roman historians themselves did not fully believe these stories either. In short, at some period in history, whether orally or in writing, these myths were formed, and 700 years after the events, when Roman historians sat down and began to research how the city was founded, these were the stories they encountered, and in the end, Instead of ignoring them, they tried to focus on the underlying meaning. This is largely what mythology is. It transforms a sex worker into a she-wolf. While telling of the murder of one brother by another, it actually tries to show how important state order and laws are. It turns the growth formula of an empire into a story where women are collectively abducted. And I want to add this interesting theory to the end of our story. Let us reconsider Romulus's actions. He kills his brother, he abducts the Sabian women, he fights with his neighbors, but at the same time, he accepts new people into Rome, forgives them, makes them citizens, and unites them. Rome actually behaved in this exact manner throughout history. First it conquered, then it made them citizens, it fought, and afterwards it integrated. Therefore, I think it would not be absurd to suggest this. Romulus was perhaps not a human being. He was the personification of Rome itself. In other words, he was a prototype of Rome's future. We will probably never know exactly what happened during the period Rome was founded, but these are the conclusions we can reach with the data we have. According to the Romans, Rome had a dark past, but order and system were born out of this dark past. That is why what these myths actually convey matters much more than what they literally say. Myths do not tell us the past as it was. They show us how people living in the past made sense of the world, and sometimes this is even more instructive than the events themselves. In its initial founding years, Rome was a small settlement located in the Latium region of central Italy. None of the magnificent and impressive public buildings that come to mind today when Rome is mentioned had been built yet during that period. Rome back then consisted of nothing more than earthen factories that turned to mud when it rained, small houses lined up haphazardly, and a few hundred enclosed plots of land. It resembled a small village much more than a city. Compared to the complex warfare systems and well-equipped military units that would be implemented later, the Roman army in those years had an extremely simple and disorganized structure, just like the city itself. When we say Roman soldier, the Roman legionnaires familiar to us from movies, TV series, and games generally come to mind. However, during this period, Roman soldiers looked much more like this. These were property-owning citizen militias who served without pay during wartime. The vast majority were farmers and merchants living in 8th century before Christ Rome. This actually meant that Rome did not possess a real army in those years. Citizens would join the army in times of war, and when the war ended, they would be discharged and returned to their daily lives. The state set aside an allowance to cover the expenses of these soldiers, but this amount was quite small. Soldiers had to provide their own weapons and equipment. Therefore, only citizens in good financial standing could join the army. According to the Roman historian Livy, Rome's army during this period consisted of 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry provided by the 3 tribes that formed Rome. Each tribe sent 1,000 infantry and 100 cavalry to the army. Over time, as Rome established dominance over other surrounding tribes, it began to receive 1,000 infantry and 100 cavalry from each of them during wartime. The army was managed directly by the king, or a general appointed by the king. Wars in this period were small-scale. The armies had no specific battle formation. Rome's enemies consisted merely of neighboring tribes, such as the Sabines and Latins settled on nearby hills. Conflicts usually occurred as a result of woman abductions, cattle theft, or disputes over land. But it did not always remain this way. The Roman army underwent a major transformation in the 6th century before Christ. The 6th king of Rome, Servius Tullius, realized that Rome's military system would be inadequate in the long run. Therefore, to make the army more effective, he carried out a series of reforms in the military structure. Roman citizens were divided into 5 separate classes according to their wealth, and the Roman army was reorganized according to these 5 classes. The new system placed every Roman man capable of fighting into the service area most suitable for his income. For example, the infantry in the first group were Rome's wealthiest citizens, and like the hoplites in Greece, they were equipped with helmets, armor, swords, and spears. In contrast, the citizens in the 5th group at the bottom rung of the system were the poorest. They fought without armor, using slings or spears. The change experienced during the Servian period was not limited to this. The Romans adopted a new warfare system that would give them superiority in the region. In place of the disorganized army, it gave way to the phalanx system, where soldiers moved as a whole and in an organized manner. The origins of the phalanx dated back to ancient Greece. This system is thought to have reached Rome around the 6th century through Greek colonies established in southern Italy. Compared to the old disorganized system, the phalanx was a great innovation for the Roman army. Since its application required a certain level of experience, soldiers had to practice extensively. Thus the time Roman citizens set aside for military service lengthened. The standard formation of the phalanx was in the form of a long wall of shields consisting of lines 8 men deep. Each of the soldiers moved as a single piece, like a packed group. In the first years they adopted the phalanx system, the Romans easily gained superiority over their haphazardly fighting opponents. But as they began to expand toward central Italy, they realized this system had some disadvantages. The phalanx was an effective battle tactic. However, it caused soldiers to move slowly. While units were fighting in open areas, they could not take position in time to meet attacks coming from different directions. The maneuverability problem was not limited to this either. Central Italy consisted of mountainous terrain, and the phalanx order did not possess the flexibility to advance on sloping terrain or easily cross mountain passes. The locals of the region executed hit-and-run tactics very well and also used long-range weapons. Such attacks rendered Rome's phalanx ranks useless. In addition to all this, the Romans had also lost a series of struggles they entered against the Samnites at the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ. They now needed to reconsider their warfare system. Military reforms carried out around the 3rd century before Christ created a fundamental change in the Roman army. The name of the new system was manipulus, meaning handful. Since it was first covered by the Roman historian Polybius, this system is also known today as the Polybian system. According to this system, each legion was divided into 3 separate units. These units were named hastati, principes, and triarii. The hastati, consisting of 10 battalions of 120 men, stood in the front lines of the army. These were young and inexperienced soldiers, newly enlisted in the Roman army, who had recently completed their training. The second line was formed by principes units, again consisting of 10 battalions of 120 men. They were more experienced than the hastati, however. These were not Rome's best soldiers. The most senior ones were the triarii, occupying the third line and having a total strength of 600 men. In addition to these, each legion contained light armored velites units consisting of 1,200 men and 300 cavalry tasked with protecting the flanks of the army. To make a rough description, manipulus was a battle system where inexperienced and young soldiers took place in the front line, while the more senior ones formed the rear ranks of the army. The system also brought along a new formation. In the phalanx system, the lines were in a straight row. In the manipulus, the battalions adopted a new formation organized like a checkerboard. Principes battalions filled the gaps in the hastati line, and triarii battalions filled the gaps in the principes line. The initial attack would begin with the hastati hurling spears called palum into the enemy line. After this, hand-to-hand combat would take place with swords drawn. When the hastati grew tired, the principes units would take their place, and when the principes grew tired, the triarii, the most experienced unit of the army, would take their place. After this, the triarii were expected to finish off the enemy. If the triarii were defeated, it meant the battle was now lost. Related to this, a saying even emerged in Rome used in daily life for situations where things were going poorly. Rem ad triarios redisse, meaning matters have come down to the triarii. This saying was generally used to emphasize that a more experienced person was needed in situations where things could not be resolved. Another thing that changed in a military sense during this period was the equipment used by the soldiers. Hastati and principes units possessed similar equipment to one another. Soldiers of both units carried spears, called pilum, that they threw into enemy lines before entering hand-to-hand combat. The range of these spears could reach up to 30 meters in the hands of an experienced soldier. However, for hastati units, this range was usually around 15 to 20 meters, until the 3rd century. Before Christ, soldiers in the legions wielded different styles of swords within their own financial means. By the time the 3rd century before Christ arrived, the gladius, produced from Spanish steel, became the standard sword used by Roman soldiers. Compared to older swords, it was more effective, sturdier, and more lethal. In those days, almost all armies using the gladius established superiority over others. For defense, large rectangular shields called scutum began to be used. The triarii, unlike the first 2 lines, were equipped in a manner similar to the phalanx, a traditional spear and a round shield. However, they were not as cumbersome as phalanx soldiers. They adopted a looser formation. This provided soldiers the opportunity to fight and move individually. The manipulus, when compared to the old Roman phalanx, provided units with greater mobility. The army had now begun to move rapidly, even on the most difficult terrain. This mobility allowed Rome to expand in central and southern Italy. In the Roman-Carthaginian Wars, the Roman army fought in accordance with this system. In the Battle of the Trebia River in 218 before Christ, the units that kept the Carthaginian army's units that had secretly circled around to the rear away from the rest of the Roman soldiers were the triarii. Again, thanks to the same system, in the Battle of Zama that took place in 202 before Christ, Roman legions under the command of Scipio Africanus managed to defeat the army of Hannibal Barca of Carthage. However, conditions did not always remain this way. As Rome's borders expanded, the manipulus began to lose its functionality. A new military system was needed, and along with this system, Rome's famous legionnaires would emerge. Around the 2nd century before Christ, Rome was on the verge of a major political, economic, and military transformation. The Republic was no longer merely a regional power. It had become a powerful state fighting all across the Mediterranean. The manipula system we mentioned in the previous section was ideal for fighting against the local tribes of central Italy. However, as borders expanded, Rome began to face stronger states with larger armies. The manipulus was now remaining inadequate. The defeat of an 80,000-man Roman army by united Germanic tribes in the Battle of Arusio, which took place in October of the year 105 before Christ, caused belief in military reforms to increase even further. Right at this point, the dilemma Rome found itself in gave Gaius Marius, an influential figure in Roman politics and the army, the opportunity to restructure the Roman army. Marius possessed a brilliant career both militarily and politically. He had been elected consul 7 times. He was the first Roman general to have more influence over his legions than the Senate. His victories against the Numidians between the years 110 and 105 before Christ had increased his popularity among the soldiers and the public. However, what would bring him real fame were the reforms he would make in the army. Before Marius, the Roman army possessed a closed structure in which only property-owning citizens could participate. This situation restricted the number of legionnaires who could join the army. The first thing Marius did was to abolish these laws. Now every Roman citizen, whether possessing property or not, could enlist in the army. This was an important innovation that eliminated some disadvantages of the old system. For most property-owning soldiers consisted of farmers, and a military service that would last 10 years in a distant province like Spain meant the bankruptcy of a small landowner. The new system paved the way for a large community eager for long-term military service who had no fields behind them to leave in their homeland. These would become Rome's full-time professional soldiers. Furthermore, the understanding of military service based on age and seniority was also eliminated. Hastati, Principes, and Triarii were replaced by cohort units where every soldier was equipped with uniform weapons. The pilum and gladius, redeveloped by Marius, became the standard weapons used by Roman soldiers. The rectangular-shaped shield, the scutum, would become indispensable, especially for the testudo tactic to be applied by the Romans in later years. In addition to all this, Marius designed a backpack that allowed soldiers to carry all their provisions and equipment. This bag was named Marius's Mules in honor of its designer. Now, Roman soldiers carried their own clothes, set up their own camps, cooked their own meals, and built roads and bridges. Before the military reform, the Roman army carried 5 different standards: the eagle, the wolf, the minotaur, the horse, and the bear. Marius gathered all Roman legions under a single symbol. This symbol was the eagle standard called the aquila. That expanding borders required long-term military service and larger armies had been discussed for some time. Providing various incentives to increase the strength of the army could solve this problem. Toward this end, Marius's next step was to pass laws that would make the military profession more attractive to citizens. In previous centuries, Roman soldiers covered the expenses of their equipment themselves. This meant wealthy soldiers had better equipment and poor soldiers had worse equipment. Marius completely abolished this practice. From then on, the equipment of soldiers would be covered by the state. In addition to this, soldiers were granted a considerable salary. Furthermore, when they retired, they no longer returned to an impoverished life. In return for their service to the Roman army, they were rewarded with land by the state. In this way, soldiers were prevented from feeling anxiety about their futures. However, it is useful to state this point as well. The lands given to soldiers were sometimes deliberately chosen from infertile areas, mountain slopes, or marshy regions. The selection of such lands, distant from a central region for army members or where the soil was unfit for cultivation, shows that soldiers' retirement bonuses were not always satisfying. During this period, the greatest change took place in the structure of the army. The old manipulus battalions were gone, replaced by cohort battalions that were larger than them. Now let us examine this new system closely. The smallest unit in the cohort system was the contubernium, consisting of 8 soldiers. These soldiers stayed in the same tent, shared the same food, used the same millstone and the same pack animals. In each contubernium, there were 2 auxiliary attendants assisting the soldiers. These did not participate in battles. They looked after errands, such as cooking meals, setting up camps, clearing roads, and caring for large animals. In other words, the contubernium was the lowest unit of the Roman army, consisting of 10 people in total, 8 soldiers and 2 auxiliaries. Contubernia were under the direction of decani. These were chosen as a result of a vote by the other soldiers in the contubernium. While on the topic, let us squeeze in that the title of dean used in universities today originates from the word decanus, and let us continue. The next higher unit in the Roman army was the century, that is, companies, formed by 10 contubernia coming together. A century consisted of 100 people in total, 80 soldiers and 20 auxiliaries. Centuries were directed by centurions, who were senior soldiers of the Roman army. Decani did not receive promotions. They were chosen by their own contubernia. They had no tactical role in the Roman army. However, centurions were different. These were career soldiers of Rome, and they rose to this position by receiving promotions. Their salaries were 10 times higher than regular legionnaire soldiers. Every centurion had a second commander assisting him, namely his optio. These two men were responsible for the discipline and training of the legion. During battle, centurions commanded their companies at the front of the line. Options, on the other hand, waited in the rearmost rank. Options took position in this manner to stop soldiers who might attempt to flee during battle and, if necessary, punish them. Another higher unit in the Roman army was the cohort battalion, consisting of 6 centuries. They possessed a unique structure in terms of command. The most senior centurion within the cohort became the commander of the cohort, while other centurions received orders directly from him. In other words, the entire cohort was under the command of the most experienced centurion. When a centurion died or retired, the next most experienced person took his place. The most senior centurion within the legion was the primus pilus, commanding the first century of the first cohort. These soldiers could later receive promotions to become camp commanders. A cohort contained 480 soldiers and 120 auxiliaries in total. The coming together of 10 cohorts and the addition of 120 cavalry to them formed a legion with a total strength of 4,920 soldiers. Legions were usually supported by auxiliary forces provided by Rome's allies. These were units directed by their own commanders and applying their own battle tactics. The majority consisted of Gallic tribes and Germanic peoples, usually filling the army's cavalry deficit. Command of the legion was held by legati, that is, legion commanders, appointed to this post by the Senate for a specific period. Immediately below the legion commander was a military tribune, again chosen by the Senate. These men were usually individuals with good political careers who would soon become senators. With Marius's reforms, military service had become much more attractive than before. Salaries were not very high. On the other hand, the spoils collected on campaigns were quite motivating, especially in large-scale campaigns like Caesar's Gallic campaign. Furthermore, with these reforms, the Roman army was made suitable for covering long distances, establishing headquarters thousands of kilometers away from Rome and fighting on 3 separate continents. In 60 before Christ, the wealthiest man in the Roman Republic was Marcus Licinius Crassus. His wealth exceeded 200 million sesterces. The Roman historian Plutarch says this amount corresponded to 229 tons of gold. By a simple calculation, Crassus's wealth corresponds to around $14 billion today. However, being wealthy was not enough to achieve fame and glory in Rome. One had to win victories on the battlefield. Crassus was ready to spend his wealth for this cause. Yet facing him was one of the most powerful generals in Roman history, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, that is, Pompey the Great. By the time 60, before Christ arrived, the tension between the pair had reached its peak. Rome was being dragged into a civil war just as it had 30 years prior. The outbreak of conflict was a matter of time. But a rising Roman soldier prevented the potential conflict by proposing an agreement to these two rivals. This young Roman soldier was Gaius Julius Caesar, one of history's most famous figures. Crassus sat at the same table with the 2 most powerful names in Roman history during one of history's most turbulent periods. He owed this position to his magnificent wealth accumulated throughout his life rather than his military achievements. So how had Crassus acquired this wealth? To find the answer to this question, we need to go to the year 115 before Christ, to the heart of the Roman Republic, that is, to the city of Rome. Crassus was born in Rome in 115 before Christ. His family was not noble, but belonged to the Latinia clan, and this clan was part of a highly respected plebeian background. Family members being active in the Senate contributed over time to their accumulating a degree of wealth. A portion of this wealth was formed by the silver mines they owned. Crassus's father Publius, being elected consul in 97 before Christ, and later serving as governor of Spain, improved the family's position even further. Like most Roman governors, Publius enriched himself greatly during his governorship. Yet, because they relied on the plebeian vote, they did not possess wealth as vast as the privileged wealthy class. However, Rome's social and political division over hundreds of years would play an important role in Crassus adding wealth to his wealth. By 91 before Christ, Rome entered a turbulent period. Certain cities in Italy allied with the Republic declared that they wanted to become Roman citizens not only for status and population, but also to possess the right to vote in Roman elections. They had displayed loyalty to Rome for over 200 years and wanted to receive its return. However, the Romans fiercely opposed the demands of the Italians and refused to grant them citizenship. The rebellions, organized by Italian allies against Roman rule, eventually caused a destructive war to break out. In 90 before Christ, an army commanded by 2 Roman consuls launched attacks against allies in the north and south. In the north, Publius Rutilius Lupus was assigned as consul, and in the south, Lucius Julius Caesar. Gaius Marius and Pompeius Strabo advised Publius. The advisorship to Lucius Julius Caesar belonged to Cornelius Sulla and Titus Didius. 2 figures stood out in winning the war, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Rising in Rome always brought ambition and drive along with it. It happened again, and eventually Marius and Sulla came face to face. In 87 before Christ, Sulla left Rome to organize a campaign against King Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus. Taking advantage of this situation, Marius seized control of the capital. His target was his rival's supporters. He began to persecute Sulla's supporters who did not support him. Crassus's father and brother lost their lives as a result of these persecutions, fueled by Marius's rage. Crassus somehow managed to flee Rome and arrived in Spain in 85 before Christ. This tragic event created a perfect turning point in Crassus's life. Considering that his father had previously served as governor of Spain, it was no coincidence that Crassus chose Spain to flee to. In Spain, there were properties and mines left from his family. Thanks to these, he would soon grow stronger and begin rebuilding his political career. When Marius died in 86 before Christ, the balance of power in Rome suddenly changed. An opportunity to seize the capital fell into Sulla's hands once again, and the experienced general did not want to miss this opportunity. He took action to bring Rome under his rule again. His greatest ally in this war was Crassus, operating in Spain. Crassus, using his wealth and family connections, formed a private army for Sulla in the Iberian Peninsula. This alliance he made with Sulla would create a tremendous environment for Crassus to expand his wealth. In 82 before Christ, Sulla achieved the victory he desired and seized Rome. All that remained was to take revenge on those who had sided with his rival. Everyone who was a supporter of Marius was deemed a traitor and executed. Burning with the fire of revenge, Sulla did not stop. However, after a while, the non-stop executions began to disturb even Sulla's supporters. When this situation drew backlash, a list containing condemned prisoners was prepared, and the assets of everyone whose name was on the list were confiscated. Afterwards, these goods began to be sold at auction for cheap prices. These highly valuable properties and lands found buyers at nearly half price. Those who benefited most from this practice were Sulla's relatives and favorites. Crassus was at the top of these due to his role in achieving the victory. While Sulla, having seized power in Rome, was busy sidelining his rivals, Crassus began buying up the properties of these rivals for next to nothing. The structures he bought had been built to find a solution to the influx of immigrants coming to Rome after the Civil War in 91 before Christ. These buildings were called insulae. The main material of these structures was stone. Because they were flimsy, they faced the danger of collapsing over time. Furthermore, a second story made of wood was frequently added to insulae. This situation caused another danger to arise for the insulae: fires. Fires were quite common in Rome, yet the city had no organized system to respond to these fires. This situation had played right into Crassus's hands. When Crassus saw a burning building, he would go to its owner and buy the building from him. Afterwards, he would order the slaves under his command to extinguish the fire. In this way, he added wealth to his wealth and owned many properties in a short time. All that remained was to make a profit by renting these buildings to those in need. However, wealthy and powerful landowners like Crassus did not have the time to collect rent from so many tenants. They needed to focus on their political careers, and tracking the income obtained from their properties was a task that required dedicated time. For this reason, they needed people who could collect rents and look after damaged buildings. Two methods had been developed for this in Rome. The first of these was properties managed by slaves. Slaves in Rome had a strong bond with their masters. Some landowners transferred the management responsibility of their properties to a trusted slave. This applied method was profitable for property owners, for slaves transferred all of the profit obtained from the property to the owner. However, this method brought some difficulties as well. It was hard for landowners to find reliable slaves they could assign to the properties they owned. Furthermore, although slaves were assigned to property management, all expenses regarding the maintenance of the property were covered by the property owner. Therefore, this practice was not a method preferred by Crassus. The buildings he bought covered the properties of Sulla's wealthy rivals. Alongside damaged buildings, he had also come to own quality properties. During this period, he bought nearly 500 slaves consisting of architects and builders. He repaired damaged buildings thanks to these slaves. Afterwards, to manage the buildings in his possession, he gave them to master tenants. Master tenants were individuals who bought a property and held all rights to this property. They paid a fixed annual amount to the landowner. Afterwards, they tried to earn more money than the money they gave to the property owner and managed the property independently. Although this method seemed like a low-profit agreement for the property owner, it was highly beneficial. The property owner did not deal with daily expenses. Furthermore, because he received a year's advance rent, he was not affected by negative situations, such as the tenant leaving or rent being paid late. In addition to this, it was impossible for Crassus to directly control all the properties he owned. Master tenants provided Crassus with considerable convenience in this respect. In addition to acquiring wealth by renting properties, Crassus also earned money by using slaves. Slaves, who became the lifeblood of the Roman Republic, were far more valuable than mines and lands. These slaves, made to work as heavy laborers or assigned as teachers, doctors, stewards, or architects, held great importance in making daily life in Rome easier. However, life for a slave could also be quite full of suffering. High-profile slaves had a more comfortable life compared to others. But the same could not be said for unskilled slaves, or slaves forced to fight to the death as gladiators. Their lives were quite difficult. This social injustice led over time to several slave rebellions. The most sensational of these rebellions was the Third Servile War started by a slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a former gladiator. In 73 before Christ, he launched a major slave uprising against the Roman Republic. The number of those gathered around him reached 70,000 to 120,000 in a short time. This army, the vast majority of which consisted of slaves, posed a serious threat to the Roman Republic. Spartacus eliminated 2 separate Roman armies until the year 71 before Christ. His target was Rome, the capital of the Roman Republic. The Senate initially did not show the necessary attention to the slave rebellion, but Spartacus's army, winning consecutive victories, allowed them to realize the dimensions of the danger. They needed a powerful army and a talented general to quell the rebellion. The most suitable candidate for this task was Crassus, who was serving as praetor at the time. Crassus was placed at the head of the army. 40,000 soldiers consisting of Rome's best legions were given under his command. Spartacus and his army were cornered and defeated by Crassus's 8 legions in Lucania, located in southern Italy. A portion died in battle, and a portion managed to flee and save themselves. However, they too were caught and killed by Crassus's rival Pompey. The surviving 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way connecting Italy to Rome on Crassus's orders. This ruthless display would remind potential rebels that they should not even let the thought of starting an uprising pass through their minds. The war effectively ended in 71 before Christ. It was now time for Crassus to return to Rome. He had quelled a major rebellion and expected to be honored in return for this victory. However, nothing went as he hoped. Crassus had defeated Spartacus on the battlefield and saved Italy and Rome. Despite this, Pompey, who cleaned up the remnants of the slave army, received all the praise. What fell to Crassus's share was a simple ceremony. Yes, Crassus was a wealthy man. He owned many properties, lands, works of art, and statues. He had even bought most of Aristotle's library. Yet, unlike his contemporaries, he did not flaunt his wealth publicly. He behaved as politely as possible to the Roman people. In this way, he slowly climbed the steps of wealth while winning the public's trust as well. However, wealth alone meant nothing to him. The only thing he permanently desired was prestige, and only a military victory could provide this prestige. But now, having to share Pompey's victory and Pompey receiving all the praise had upended Crassus's plan. Nevertheless, Rome's political structure brought along unexpected alliances alongside deadly enmities. The wealthy took promising individuals under their protection to reach the top of the hierarchical structure and maintain their status there. Supporting promising names to elevate their positions was a frequently preferred method for political figures, for the supported person would pay back the favors done for them in abundance. At this point, Crassus took a historic step, using this method to increase his prestige in the eyes of the public. He had discovered a soldier who drew attention with his intellect and talent, Gaius Julius Caesar. To be honest, this alliance suited Caesar as well. He had spent huge sums of money to build his military career and had eventually begun swimming in a sea of debt. Crassus paid all of Caesar's debts and took the young man under his protection. Thus, the foundation of an alliance that would last for many years was laid. Crassus, joining forces with Caesar, was highly uneasy with Pompey, with whom he was forced to share his victory. The rivalry between them continued without slowing down. But despite this disagreement, the pair was elected consuls in 70 before Christ. According to the historian Plutarch, Pompey was initially deemed suitable to represent the consulship. Crassus had asked for help from Pompey at that time so that he too would be elected consul. This situation played right into Pompey's hands. If Crassus rose, thanks to him, he would feel indebted to Pompey. In this respect, accepting Crassus's request would be an extremely profitable deal for Pompey. Thus, 2 great statesmen who hated each other surprisingly met on common ground. Roman politics would now be shaped by Crassus and Pompey. An opportunity had fallen into Crassus's hands to increase his wealth and influence. Joining with Pompey, they invalidated the constitution that had been put into effect years ago by Sulla. Thus, Crassus and Pompey also seized the political structure of Rome. However, the rivalry between these two continued despite their political partnership. Crassus had finally obtained the status he wanted, but it could not be said he was very successful at getting the Senate to accept his word. The reforms he presented were rejected by the Senate. Worse yet, while he experienced political defeats, his rival Pompey continued to gain strength day by day. However, the breakdown of this alliance could endanger the future of the Roman Republic. Crassus was wealthy, and his providing financial support to Rome was highly important. Pompey's military victories were nonstop. If this alliance broke, both would withdraw their resources. The person who would stop this contention would be Gaius Julius Caesar, one of Crassus's greatest supporters. Caesar enabled the establishment of a new alliance by restraining the ambition and jealousy between the pair. When Caesar's talent, Crassus's financial support, and Pompey's military power combined, a powerful alliance was established that could seize control of the state. This alliance went down in Roman history as the first triumvirate. The three members of the triumvirate assumed the administration of three separate regions. Gaul was given to Caesar, Spain to Pompey. Crassus was placed in a region more prestigious than all of them, Syria, located in the east of Rome. From Rome's perspective, the east was more developed than the western provinces. The region was connected to one another by a wide road network and was highly rich in terms of resources. This situation whetted the appetite of Rome's potential enemies. Consequently, the region was under the danger of possible attacks. Crassus's first year in Syria passed quite productively. The resources in the region were at his fingertips, and the wealth he already possessed increased exponentially. The victories he won were no longer remaining in Pompey's shadow. Military successes added courage to Crassus's courage. In 53 before Christ, crossing the Euphrates River with his legions, he entered the territory of the Parthian kingdom. Parthia possessed rich lands, and this situation inevitably triggered Crassus's ambition. At the same time, he wanted to reach the military status of Pompey and Caesar. A victory to be won against the Parthians would create a turning point in Crassus's military career. But to do all this, he needed support. He requested help from Ariamnes, the ruler of Osroene, who had previously provided military support to Pompey as well. Ariamnes regularly received money from Parthia, and this attack would mean the cutting off of Ariamnes' money source. For this reason, he suggested to Crassus that he launch an attack immediately, telling him that the Parthian kingdom possessed a weak and disorganized army. Crassus was unaware of the trap he fell into. As a result of Ariamnes' direction, he found himself and his army in a desolate and arid desert. In the Battle of Carrhae, which took place in 53 before Christ, the Parthian army, despite being smaller in number, caught the Roman legions off guard. Crassus and his army suffered severe losses in the battle. However, a group of soldiers, including Crassus himself, managed to retreat. The thousands they left behind were slaughtered by the Parthians. The Parthian general Surena sent a message to the Romans requesting a meeting. Crassus did not want to accept defeat and meet with the general. However, he faced another danger. His legions were on the verge of rebellion. If he did not accept the meeting, his army's uprising would be inevitable. Thereupon, Crassus agreed to meet with the Parthian general Surena. But something went wrong during the negotiations. Roman historians do not say anything clear about what exactly happened in these peace negotiations that resulted in Crassus's death. According to the account of the historian Plutarch, General Surena presented a beautiful horse to Crassus as a sign of his goodwill. However, as Crassus accepted this gift and mounted the horse, a scuffle broke out, and he was killed by Parthian soldiers along with his staff beside him. Crassus's death caused the removal of one of the sides in the inevitable struggle for the summit in Roman history. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey left its place to a power struggle between Caesar and Pompey. Crassus had lost his life, but the conflict in Rome continued at full speed, and the civil war process that would occupy Rome for years had now begun. In Spain, 32-year-old Caesar, carrying out his duty as quaestor, looked at the statue of Alexander the Great located here and felt a deep shame within himself. Alexander had seized more than half of the known world years before reaching his age. Yet until that day, Caesar had achieved no serious success that affected the world. For an ambitious soldier in the grip of a power struggle that had been going on for years, this was not an acceptable situation. He had to change the world and write his name in history no matter what. From this point on, he decided to do whatever was necessary to obtain more power. We encounter this event in the parallel lives of the Greek historian Plutarch, and the work The 12 Caesars by the Roman historian Suetonius, writing years after Caesar's death. So what kind of life had Caesar, one of the world's most recognized historical figures, lived up to this point? How had what he experienced until reaching the age of 32 affected him? And where would the path he would follow in later years to obtain more power lead him? To answer all of these, we need to leave Caesar lamenting at the head of Alexander's statue right here and return to Rome 32 years prior. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in Rome in the year 100 before Christ as the son of a couple belonging to the Julia family. When Caesar was born, the Julia family was not very powerful. Despite this, they had a deep-rooted history. According to legend, members of this family descended from Aeneas, the Trojan prince and son of the goddess Venus. Although not very wealthy or influential, their prestige and history allowed them to gain acceptance among the class of nobles called patricians in Rome. When we look individually at family members, we see that their position was actually not bad at all. For example, his father Gaius Julius Caesar, who bore the same name as Caesar, had served as governor in Rome's Asian province. His aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, one of the leading figures of the Roman Republic. His mother Aurelia was the daughter of a family with powerful connections in Rome. Though not among Rome's absolute best, Caesar's family had a certain amount of power both politically and militarily. There are not many records regarding Caesar's childhood. However, we can determine, especially through historians writing a few hundred years after Caesar's death like Suetonius, that his life changed considerably with his father's sudden death in 85 before Christ. Caesar at 16 suddenly found himself as a responsible young man at the head of his family. Right at this moment, a civil war broke out between his aunt's husband, Gaius Marius, and his rival Lucius Sulla. Both sides constantly strived to obtain more power and did not hesitate to stain their hands with blood. Roman politics was divided into two factions. The first faction, named Optimates, favored aristocratic rule within the Senate, while the other faction, named Populares, favored direct elections. Caesar's uncle Marius belonged to the Populares faction, his rival Sulla to the Optimates faction. At first, fortune smiled on Sulla, and he achieved consecutive victories against his rivals. However, in 86 before Christ, with Marius and his ally Cornelius Cinna seizing administration in Rome, the process reversed. Caesar received his own share from Marius's victory. Thanks to the position his relatives obtained in Rome, he was nominated to become a high-level priest of Jupiter. Jupiter held a primary position among Roman gods, and being the priest of this god would undoubtedly provide Caesar with countless advantages, bringing him great respectability and power. Only there was a problem. Priests of Jupiter could only marry women belonging to the noble patrician class. A patrician himself, Caesar's fiancée, belonged to the plebeian class, that is, she was an ordinary citizen. Caesar, determined to become a priest, separated from this woman and married Cornelia, the daughter of Cornelius Cinna. Caesar's career had actually started not bad at all. Thanks to his relatives, he had reached a privileged position. He was married to the daughter of one of the two men ruling Rome. For now, everything was going well. However, everything could change at any moment in Rome, and Caesar was going to have to learn this the hard way. Shortly after seizing control in Rome with Marius's death, fortune smiled on Sulla once again, and in 82, before Christ, the administration of Rome changed hands once more. For Caesar, the nephew of Marius's wife and Cinna's son-in-law, this meant a disaster. Respectively, his priesthood post was taken from him. His inheritance and the property he received as a dowry from his wife Cornelia were confiscated. Following this, he was forced to divorce. Despite all this, at the risk of his life, he opposed the divorce order and began living the life of a fugitive. Caesar, who at a young age had been brought to one of Rome's religiously most important posts, had lost everything in just a few years, hitting absolute rock bottom, to put it plainly. In return, the weight of these bad days for Caesar would be partially lightened by his mother stepping in. His mother Aurelia, using some connections, including Sulla's supporters, requested her son's pardon. Although Sulla did not return Caesar's confiscated properties, he agreed to pardon him. Caesar feared Sulla would change his mind at any moment and have him executed. For himself, the best option for now would be to move away from Sulla, that is, from Rome. In 81, before Christ, he joined the army and went to the Asian province where his father had once served as governor. Although he had been expelled from a high-level priesthood post and forced to join the army, the actual period in Caesar's life that would bring him to the power he desired had just begun. With the start of this period, that is, his military career, Caesar would carve out the new path that would change his life himself. He had decided to follow the path of cursus honorum, extending all the way to the consulship, the highest post of the Roman Republic. Cursus honorum means course of offices in Latin. To cover distance on this path, serving in military posts for approximately 10 years was mandatory. A young Roman joined the army at 17 and rose in the army for 10 years. After a 10-year term of service, he gained the right to be elected as tribunus militum, that is, military administrator. The administrator continuing this post for a while was afterwards elected quaestor, that is, treasury officer. For those completing their duty as quaestor, there were two separate paths in cursus honorum. Non-nobles could become tribunus plebis, a kind of public representative. Nobles, at this stage, could continue their path from the post of aedile. Administrators in the post of aedile organized games, festivals, and gladiator fights to entertain the public and nobles. Although it might not sound very important, for Roman politics, where winning people's love and support was crucial, this post could become a great source of power and popularity. The person completing their duty at this stage came to the post of praetor. Praetors served as general administrators, possessing authority to judge citizens and pass sentences regarding them. On the final step of cursus honorum, there was the consulship. Consuls served as leaders of the Senate and the state. Their term of service was 1 year at most. 2 different consuls were elected in one period. Consuls had the authority to veto each other's decisions. In this way, a single person was prevented from obtaining unlimited power. The path Caesar decided to follow was this exact cursus honorum path. He wanted to pass all stages, become consul, and use the authority he obtained to solidify his position. This was going to be a difficult and long path. However, he would show everyone in a short time that he was a man who could face this difficulty. When Sulla died in 78 before Christ, Caesar decided it would now be safe to return to Rome. He could not get back the properties confiscated in Sulla's time. Therefore, with the money he collected during his military years, he bought a house in the Subura neighborhood where Rome's low-income people lived. He began using his superior qualities and ambition in the field of law to gain money and popularity. He entered a relentless struggle against governors whose names were involved in corruption and extortion, and he was quite successful in this regard. In a short time, he had removed many governors famed for their corruption from office. In this period of Caesar's life, a serious event occurred showing his ambition and determination. For reasons not fully known, Caesar embarked on a journey over the Aegean Sea in 75 before Christ. Some sources state the purpose of this journey was to go to the island of Crete or Rhodes and take rhetoric, that is, public speaking, lessons from philosophers there. The reason for this was probably related to a desire to develop his public speaking talent and become an even more influential politician in Rome. However, during this journey, detailed by the Roman historian Suetonius, things do not go very well for Caesar, and he is taken captive by a group of pirates. The pirates' goal is not to kill Caesar, but to hold him hostage and receive a ransom. Throughout his captivity, Caesar gets along quite well with those detaining him. When the pirates ask for 20 silver pieces for Caesar, Caesar says his life is worth at least 50 silver pieces. Furthermore, mixed with a joke, he adds that one day he will find them all and crucify them. The pirates, thinking Caesar is joking, do not care much about this threat. However, very shortly after his ransom is paid and he is released, Caesar finds the pirates, and, just as he said, has them all killed and crucified. During Caesar's captivity, there was no other eyewitness beside him who could verify these words. In other words, we do not know whether he actually said these things to the pirates. However, his finding and having them killed immediately after escaping the pirates detaining him gives us an idea, even if small, regarding Caesar's ambition and determination. Shortly after this event, Caesar was recalled to the army. Pausing his legal career in Rome, he took the path to the Asian province once again. Here, he completed the 10-year military process necessary to step onto the first rung of cursus honorum. Afterwards, he returned to Rome and took the title of tribunus militum. That is, he became a military administrator. Thus, he had reached the first post on the path of cursus honorum. Serving as tribunus militum for a while, Caesar was elected quaestor, that is, treasury officer, in the year 69 before Christ. Shortly after this, he lost his aunt Julia, and after her, his wife Cornelia. Following the funerals of his aunt and wife, he went to Spain to serve as quaestor. It was here that the moment we mentioned at the beginning of the video took place. Caesar stood before Alexander's statue and thought that what he had done so far was inadequate. Still, there was a point where he considered himself lucky. Alexander had died, but for Caesar, nothing had ended yet. Returning to Rome 2 years after his duty here, Caesar married Pompeia, the granddaughter of his old enemy Sulla. By the time 65 before Christ arrived, he had been brought to another stage on the career steps, namely the post of aedile. As you will remember from the path of cursus honorum, statesmen in this post, alongside their official duties, organized games for the entertainment of the plebeians, the representatives of the public, and the noble patricians. Caesar began using the opportunities of his post effectively with grand games. More entertainment and spectacle meant that much respect and gratitude. One of the most important requirements of being the darling of the public was entertaining them. Caesar, whose popularity gradually increased in this way, and who gained power through his duties in the state, had his eye on high places. In 63 before Christ, he entered elections to reach the post of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priesthood title of the Roman state religion. Normally, his rivals possessed much more experience than him. However, thanks to the power of the aedile post, winning the love and support of the public made it not difficult for Caesar to win the elections. Beginning his duty as praetor in 62. Before Christ, he passed to a new stage on the path of cursus honorum, and after a while he was appointed governor to the west of Spain. Yes, Caesar was adding power to his political power, but this had a price. He constantly had to spend money for his political campaigns. This meant he had to go into debt more with every passing day. During his governorship of Spain, his debts had reached dimensions that could cause legal headaches, and only one person could help him in this regard. This man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's leading wealthy figures. For this, Caesar took the path to Rome. The pair met in Rome, and Crassus agreed to pay a portion of Caesar's debts. But Crassus had one condition. In return for the money he gave, he wanted Caesar to support him against his rival Pompey. In this period, one of the topics occupying Roman politics most was the struggle of this pair, namely Pompey and Crassus. Crassus wanted a talented politician like Caesar beside him against Pompey. This alliance could create an important opportunity for Caesar as well. Therefore, he accepted Crassus's request, even if partially. However, before his term of duty as praetor expired, he had to go to Spain. Since he had resolved the matter regarding debts, he could begin focusing on his military career once again. First, he launched a campaign against some tribes rebelling in Spain and managed to emerge victorious from each of the battles he entered. He was hailed as imperator by the legionnaires under his command. In those times, legionnaires hailed their beloved commanders as imperator after major victories. Caesar was winning the love of both his soldiers and the public with the reforms he made and the victories he won, thereby adding power to his power. By the time 60 before Christ arrived, Caesar had successfully completed his duty in Spain and returned to Rome. From this moment on, he began working to obtain the consulship, the final step of the cursus honorum path. For when he became consul, he would literally be one of the two men ruling Rome. The consular elections were quite contentious, and initially everything developed against Caesar. Marcus Porcius Cato, famed for his corruption, even distributed bribes in favor of one of Caesar's rivals. However, Caesar managed to win the elections and became consul in 59 before Christ, alongside Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. Thus, Caesar had reached the final step of cursus honorum. But he did not stop here. He had no intention of being an ordinary consul who did his duty and retired to his corner. He wanted more, and what he needed to do to obtain it was to follow a balance policy between the two most powerful men in Rome. Crassus was wealthy. Pompey was the most powerful man in Rome militarily. Caesar reconciled these two to benefit from their power, and the three men formed an alliance through an unwritten agreement among themselves. This alliance is known in Roman history as the First Triumvirate, that is, the rule of three men. The agreement had been reached. Now it was time to strengthen the alliance. The easiest way to do this was to establish family ties through marriage. Therefore, Caesar married his daughter Julia to Pompey. He himself married Calpurnia, the daughter of a powerful senator. Until this time, Caesar had gained many things he obtained thanks to the public's love. His rivals were wealthy and powerful. However, despite this, he managed to overcome them every time thanks to the public's support. For this reason, in the laws he passed during his consulship, he always acted with the public in mind. For example, in 59 before Christ, he brought a bill to the Senate. According to this bill, public lands would be distributed in a certain proportion to poor individuals. It was normally not possible for this law to be approved by the Senate. For managers thinking of their own interests rather than the public's interests was a frequently seen event during that period as well. However, Caesar had not established the alliance we just mentioned for nothing. Pompey had filled Rome with soldiers under his command to support his ally and intimidate his rivals into approving the law. The other consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, wanted to veto this bill using his consular right. However, Caesar's armed supporters removed him from the forum using force. Humiliated in front of people and openly subjected to violence, Bibulus locked himself in his house. Although he tried from time to time to object to Caesar's laws, he could not cope with him. Caesar's power rendered his consular authorities completely ineffective. Caesar had become one of the three most powerful men in Rome. In fact, with his intellect, he was directing Crassus and Pompey and using their power to build his own career. In other words, indirectly, Caesar had become the most powerful man in the Roman world during his consulship in 59 before Christ. However, on the other hand, he was approaching the end of his year of duty as consul. To secure himself, he ensured the Senate appointed him governor of the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum. Meanwhile, when the governor of the province of Transalpine Gaul died unexpectedly, he took this post upon himself as well. Caesar had serious reasons for wanting to be governor. First of all, the possibility of governors experiencing legal problems was low. Caesar, having openly violated many laws during his 1 year as consul, was trying both to move away from Rome for a while and to obtain legal immunity. In addition to this, being governor could be a highly profitable business both politically and financially. In debt due to the excessive expenditures he had made, Caesar would earn money through new military campaigns and strengthen his prestige even further with his victories. The region of Gaul, bordering the provinces he controlled, was tailor-made for military campaigns that would feed Caesar's power. Starting his campaign in 58 before Christ, Caesar almost completely seized Gaul along with his legions. Not content with this, he conducted campaigns into Britain. Although he was not as successful in Britain as in Gaul, he gained new acquisitions from this campaign as well. Caesar, as the successful commander of the Gallic War, covered great distance on the path to the summit of power. Only there was a problem. Not everyone was pleased with his rise. With every passing day, he made new enemies in Rome. His greatest problem was that he was about to lose the support of his allies. His daughter Julia, whom Caesar had married to Pompey to strengthen his alliance, had died while Caesar was on the British campaign. Although Caesar offered Pompey to marry his niece, Pompey did not accept this offer. Actually, in this way, he showed he did not want to maintain the alliance established through a family bond with Caesar. In addition to this, Caesar's other ally, Crassus, had died in 53 before Christ during a campaign he conducted against Parthia. Between 52 and 49 before Christ, the distrust and tension between Caesar and Pompey continued to increase gradually. Cato and Bibulus, who had served as consuls before the period Caesar became consul, were trying to convince Pompey to take action against Caesar. Rome was drifting toward a civil war. Finally, Caesar decided to go to Rome and take control of the situation personally, arriving with his legions at the bank of the Rubicon River in northern Italy. According to Roman law, it was illegal for a commander to cross the Rubicon River with his legions. A commander doing this was declared a traitor and deemed to have declared war on Rome. Caesar did not want to turn back from this point because turning back meant accepting to live as a fugitive. From this moment on, he could only go forward, and finally disregarding the laws, he crossed the river and began advancing toward Rome. In Roman history, this event was taken so seriously that the expression crossing the Rubicon took place in the Western world, meaning entering a point of no return, and it continued to be used even hundreds of years after Caesar's death. His rivals, receiving news that Caesar was advancing toward Rome, found the solution in fleeing. For this reason, Caesar entered Rome without serious resistance in 49 before Christ and seized the city. After placing Marcus Antonius, one of his most trusted soldiers, at the administration of the city of Rome as his deputy, he set off in pursuit of Pompey and his other rivals. Shortly after Caesar left Italy, the Senate under Marcus Antonius's influence declared Caesar dictator. Dictators in Rome were declared in extraordinary situations, and the person passing to the post of dictatorship possessed unquestionable authority for 6 months. Thus, Caesar obtained legally unquestionable power in the Roman world. Marcus Antonius was appointed as his deputy. Fighting Pompey's forces several times during this period, Caesar pursued him all the way to Egypt. However, Pompey was killed before Caesar arrived here. Now Caesar had both grown wealthy with his conquests in Gaul and become the most powerful man in the Roman world by sidelining his most important rivals. The man standing sorrowfully before Alexander's statue at 32 was, upon reaching 53, at least as powerful and mighty as him. During the time he stayed in Egypt, Caesar also took sides in the civil war here. Taking Cleopatra's side in the war between the pharaoh and his sister Cleopatra, he ensured her ascension to the Egyptian throne. Thus, he strengthened his hand by possessing influence over Egyptian lands as well. Returning to Rome after this, Caesar was declared dictator again in the final months of 48 before Christ, and held unlimited authority for 1 more year, defeating the former consul Cato at the Battle of Thapsus in 46. Before Christ strengthened his position even further, and after this victory, Caesar was declared dictator for 10 years. He had reached a power the likes of which was very difficult to see in Roman history. Perhaps he possessed even more authority and power than he had imagined years ago. When he was elected consul in 45 before Christ, this time he sat in the consular post alone, contrary to Roman traditions. Throughout his life, Caesar had won the love of many people. However, due to the things he did while obtaining power, he had also caused some to hate him. With the power he had obtained, he was certain he could do anything he wanted. In the final year of his life, he was declared dictator perpetuo, meaning dictator for life, by the Senate. However, just as everything has an end, Caesar's rule had an end too. On the 15th of March in 44 before Christ, he was killed as a result of an assassination organized by members of the Senate. In return, Caesar's life, struggle, and death completely changed Roman history. In the civil war that broke out after his death, the Roman Republic collapsed, and after a while, his nephew Octavius was declared the first Roman emperor. This empire, whose foundation Caesar laid, managed to maintain its existence until Fatih Sultan Mehmed conquered Constantinople in 1453 and put an end to the Eastern Roman Empire. We are in France in the year 52 before Christ, known then as Gaul. Here, one of the battles of immense tactical importance in history took place. But before starting this battle, let us do a small mind exercise. Imagine yourself in a situation like this. You are superior in numbers compared to your opponent, and you have defeated them several times before. However, these victories of yours occurred somewhat by chance. In addition to this, your opponent is far superior to you technologically and disciplined. What would you do in this situation? It would be hard to decide, wouldn't it? That is why it is a good thing we are not in the shoes of Vercingetorix, the Gallic tribal chief, about to engage in battle with Rome's famous general Julius Caesar. However, Vercingetorix was in this situation, and evaluating the existing conditions, he made a plan. His first choice was a pitched battle. He came face to face with Caesar near the city of Vesontio in Gaul. However, the Romans easily repulsed them. Right at this moment, Vercingetorix made one of the smartest moves he could make. Meeting Caesar in an open field was not logical. Therefore, he decided to retreat to an old fortress in the northwest, to Alesia. In this process, we can say Vercingetorix felt Caesar's breath right on his neck. He had to act fast and put his opponent in a difficult position. After retreating to Alesia with his force of approximately 80,000 men, he called for help from all four corners of Gaul. Yes, this was a logical and perhaps even flawless plan. Vercingetorix had occupied the fortified position nearby and moved into an advantageous position. If Caesar was going to fight him, he had to besiege the fortress. This meant he would deploy his units in a scattered manner. Furthermore, when help arrived, the Romans would be hit from behind and forced to fight on two fronts at once. Actually, the process seemed to be working in favor of the Gauls. However, against all this, Caesar had some plans as well. The experienced general was not a man to be easily overcome. The first thing he did was build a 16-kilometer-long wall around the fortress to cut off Vercingetorix's supply and communication routes. He supported this wall with trenches and towers. While construction work continued, Vercingetorix had managed to send another messenger team out of the fortress to ask for help from nearby tribes. When Caesar learned of this, he ordered a second wall, 21 kilometers long, to be built to stop attacks coming from outside. He deployed his army between these two walls and began to wait. The first 30-day process was like an endless trial for the Gauls. Their connection with the outside world was completely cut. Famine began to show itself slowly but with definite resolve. A portion of the people living in Alesia lost their lives during this process. The same was true for a portion of Vercingetorix's soldiers as well. Caesar, on the other hand, seemed to have little to worry about. His supply routes were open, and he could obtain any resource he wanted. The only problem was the relief army coming from outside. How large this force was is a matter of debate. Caesar, in his book Gallic War, claims the auxiliary force coming from outside was approximately 250,000 people. This figure may be exaggerated. However, even modern historians accept that this number was at least around 70,000. Vercingetorix's brother Vercassivellaunus, with the relief forces under his command, launched an attack on the Roman outer line on the first day with some units consisting of light infantry and cavalry. This initial attack was to find a weakness in the opposing side. However, Caesar quickly organized his Germanic cavalry and met this assault. Although Vercingetorix left Alesia for a simultaneous attack, seeing that the Gallic units were forced to retreat by Caesar's cavalry, he abandoned this move. The next day, the Gauls attacked the same place, this time with all their strength. However, this attack also resulted in failure because Caesar maintained good coordination in his army. Thereupon, Vercingetorix's brother expanded his army in the north and south directions, trying to find a gap in the lines. In the north, there was a hill facing the Roman lines. This hill could possibly provide an advantage. However, Vercassivellaunus wanted to guarantee the matter and ordered an all-out battle to take place on many lines simultaneously. Following this, Vercingetorix also left Alesia and launched an all-out attack against the Romans. Now the battle had literally begun. Caesar constantly moved between the lines throughout the duration of the battle, encouraging his soldiers. He identified weakening points and transferred all support forces he could field to these points. But no matter what he did, he could not capture superiority. Yes, up to now, the Roman legions had held off the attacks from both sides. However, a tiny breach to be opened meant the end of everything. The slightest mistake could bring the entire Roman army to the brink of destruction. Right at this point, Caesar went outside the wall with the Germanic cavalry he took beside him. Seizing the hill in the northern section where the Gauls were attacking heavily, he launched an attack on the enemy from here and destroyed the units there. Within a few minutes, conditions completely changed. The Gauls lost their morale. Relief forces soon began to disperse rapidly. This situation allowed the Romans to attack Vercingetorix with all their units. Vercingetorix knew very well he could not meet this attack, and now had no choice left but to retreat to Alesia. Worse yet, there was not much left he could do either. He had lost the support he received, and his attempt to break the siege had resulted in failure. Ultimately, he decided to surrender. During the battle, the Romans lost approximately 13,000 soldiers. In return, the losses of the Gallic tribes reached hundreds of thousands. Caesar had successfully stopped the largest attack made against him by the Gauls and won a magnificent victory at Alesia. This victory held the quality of a turning point in bringing Gaul completely under rule, and it would bring him immense fame. We do not need to move forward much in time for the next battle. We are just a few years later. The year 48, before Christ brought Pompeius Magnus, one of the famous generals of the ancient world, face to face with Gaius Julius Caesar, Rome's rising new power. This was an internal reckoning. The Roman Republic was dragged once again into the grip of civil war that flared up periodically for years, and the largest act of this struggle would open at Pharsalus in Greece. The Battle of Pharsalus holds quite large importance for us to better understand Caesar's military genius. In the previous battle, we saw him fight an enemy quite superior to himself numerically and succeed. However, the enemy facing him was less disciplined and worse equipped. Now his rival possessed both soldiers, equipped on equal terms with him and numerical superiority. For the Battle of Pharsalus, sources give various numbers regarding Pompeius Magnus's army. According to these records, Pompey's army consisted of at least 36,000 legionnaires and 5,000 cavalry, and at most 45,000 legionnaires and 7,000 cavalry. In other words, Pompey possessed a fighting force between 41,000 and 52,000. In contrast, Caesar had 22,000 legionnaires in his hand. The number of his cavalry was only 1,000. Caesar was facing an opponent possessing a force twice as large as his own, and this time his opponent was not a tribal chief leading Gallic tribes. He was going to struggle against the most powerful general of the period. Before the battle, Pompey lined up his numerically superior cavalry and archers on his own left flank. In this way, using his numerical advantage, he planned to envelop Caesar's army from the right flank. Caesar, noticing this, responded to this situation with a formation aimed at eliminating his rival's cavalry. He deployed his relatively few cavalry on the right flank of his army, and behind his right center, he placed 3,000 spearmen selected from various legions. The battle began with Caesar giving the order to charge to the infantry in the first line. The infantry launching the charge as they approached Pompey's army began to hurl the javelins in their hands onto enemy lines. The goal here was to wear down the enemy and disrupt their order. However, this did not work much. For this reason, Caesar's units launched a charge again, entering hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. Meanwhile, Pompey ordered his cavalry on the left flank to charge. Caesar's cavalry being few in number made stopping Pompey's attack impossible. However, Caesar had already calculated this and taken his formation accordingly. Caesar's cavalry resisted the attack for a while and, as planned, began to retreat from a certain point. Meanwhile, Caesar gave the order to the 3,000 spearmen he had deployed in the rear line to take position to meet Pompey's cavalry. Up to this moment, because the cavalry acted as a screen, the enemy units had advanced unaware of what they would face. But suddenly the cavalry dispersed, and behind them the spearmen appeared. This meant complete disaster for Pompey's cavalry. If you remember the scene in the famous movie Braveheart, you can imagine what kind of slaughter took place at Pharsalus. This tactic stopped the cavalry attack, spooked the horses, and was highly effective, just as Caesar expected. In addition to this, although Pompey's cavalry was superior in number, they were lightly armored, and the majority consisted of inexperienced soldiers. Although these novice cavalry tried to resist the attack of the spearmen, they were forced to retreat after suffering heavy losses in a short time. This situation both eliminated Pompey's cavalry and left the left flank of his army defenseless. Seeing this opportunity, Caesar ordered his spearmen and cavalry to attack the left flank of Pompey's army. Pompey, seeing his army rapidly melting away before his eyes, was forced to retreat to avoid falling captive. Caesar slaughtered the vast majority of his rival's fleeing soldiers. Thus, despite commanding a force considerably smaller than Pompey's army, thanks to the fake retreat tactic he applied, he won a great victory, and as a result, Caesar managed to become the most powerful man in the Roman Republic. Today, when the Roman Empire is mentioned, the first name coming to mind for many people is Gaius Julius Caesar. However, in the years Caesar was climbing the difficult steps of the political ladder, step by step, there was a man in Rome more powerful than everyone else. This man was Pompeius Magnus, that is, Pompey the Great. Over the years, Pompey and Rome's rising power Caesar would come face to face, and as a result, one of the most epic struggles in Roman history would be experienced. But now, to start the story, we need to go back approximately 2,100 years from today. Pompey was born in 106 before Christ in the city of Picenum, located in northeastern Italy. His father Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo was a member of the Pompey family, one of the leading families of the city of Picenum. Strabo, belonging to an important family, enabled him to gain the right to become a Roman citizen despite not being Roman. Strabo took place on the Roman side in the war that broke out in 91 before Christ between Rome and other city-states in Italy. Defeating one of the enemy armies, he seized the city of Asculum after a difficult siege. Here he had many rebel leaders executed and confiscated all their assets. When the year 87 before Christ arrived, the rivalry between that year's consuls, Gnaeus Octavius and Lucius Cornelius Cinna, turned into a civil war. Strabo had to take sides again, and, in line with his interests, took place on Gnaeus Octavius's side. But in the same year, he lost his life, probably as a result of a disease he caught. Furthermore, this time he had played the wrong horse. By the end of 87 before Christ, the civil war was won by Lucius Cornelius Cinna, the rival of Octavius and Strabo. Cinna's supporters, after seizing Rome, confiscated the assets of many people who were rivals to them and had some executed. Pompey's father Strabo was also going to be tried because of his activities in Asculum. However, because he was dead, young Pompey took over the case. If found guilty, all his goods would be confiscated, and he would even be executed. In other words, Strabo, while leaving, had inadvertently left his family in a difficult situation. Yet none of the things just listed occurred. Pompey managed to convince the judges he was innocent. He was a good orator, and thanks to his charisma, he was able to impress the judges. So much so that right after the case ended, one of the judges offered to marry him to his daughter Antistia. Pompey returned to Picenum after this event, and pursued increasing his power by gathering soldiers here. However, waters in Rome were not settling down. The following year, Gnaeus Marius, the rival of Roman general Lucius Cornelius Sulla, seized power in Rome and was elected consul. Marius, following a decision he passed through the Senate after being elected consul, had Sulla removed from office and appointed himself in his place. Sulla, on the other hand, did not comply with this decision given against him, and landed in Italy in 83 before Christ. His goal was to march on Rome with his soldiers and take over the administration. Pompey saw this situation as an opportunity. If he helped Sulla on his march to Rome, he could come to important posts when Sulla seized power. For this purpose, establishing an alliance with Sulla, he accompanied him on his march to Rome. In this process, Sulla managed to easily defeat the Roman units sent to stop him and seized control of the city in a short time. Using his power, he had the Senate declare him dictator. In Rome, people were declared dictators only in extraordinary situations, and the person passing to the post of dictatorship possessed unlimited authority for 6 months. Sulla, being brought to this position, provided him with absolute control over the Roman Republic. After this, Sulla assigned Pompey with catching his rivals who fled to Sicily and Africa. Pompey first seized Sicily. Later, landing in Africa, he defeated the enemy army at the Battle of Utica. Here he had many of Sulla's rivals executed, so much so that these activities of his would cause his opponents to give him the nickname Adolescentius Carnifex, meaning the teenage butcher. However, his own soldiers addressed Pompey, in reference to the victories he won, by the name Magnus, meaning great, Pompeius Magnus. Returning to Rome after the victory he won in Africa, Pompey requested from Sulla that a triumph be organized to honor his achievements. However, according to Roman law, only dictators, consuls, and praetors could reach this honor. That is why Sulla initially did not want to accept this, but faced with Pompey's insistence and unrest breaking out in the city, he was forced to allow it. Pompey, thanks to this, made an entry into Rome with a grand ceremony and celebrated his victory before the public. This celebration caused his fame and prestige to increase rapidly. When 87 before Christ arrived, Sulla lost his life. This had a single meaning. The dictator was dead. There was a power at the summit waiting to be seized. In other words, Rome was going to be dragged into a storm once again. In 87 before Christ, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was elected consul alongside Quintus Lutatius Catulus. The following year, the consular term of both had ended, and Lepidus had been appointed governor to the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul by the Senate. However, Lepidus, refusing to accept this, decided to march on Rome with his soldiers. His goal was to press the Senate and be elected consul a second time. Thereupon, the Senate declared Lepidus a public enemy and assigned Pompey and Catulus with stopping him. The pair, after a few battles, managed to defeat Lepidus and his supporters. Lepidus, after being defeated, managed to board ships with a portion of his army and retreat to Sardinia, though he lost his life here. The soldiers who came to Sardinia with him were brought to Spain by his ally Perperna and delivered to Sertorius. Sertorius was one of Sulla's rivals in 82. Before Christ, he had taken head of the Hispania province, but was removed from here by Sulla's supporters. Thereupon, he supported a rebellion started by a local Iberian tribe, and defeating the Roman army coming to quell the rebellion, established dominance in Spain. After the victory Pompey won against Lepidus, the Senate requested Pompey discharge his army and return to Rome. However, Pompey did not want to return to Rome. Instead, he was in a desire to enlarge the scale of his victory. Therefore, he rejected the Senate's request and requested to be assigned with quelling the rebellion in Hispania. After the Senate accepted this proposal, setting off with the soldiers under his command, he reached Hispania in 76 before Christ. During the long-term struggle Pompey engaged in with Sertorius, Sertorius was killed in 72 before Christ by his own ally Perperna. Perperna, who took head of the army after Sertorius' death, was defeated by Pompey. Following this victory, Pompey, ensuring peace and order in the region, set off to return to Rome with his army in 71 before Christ. At the time Pompey conducted his campaign in Hispania, the main agenda in the Roman Senate was the uprising, started by a slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave fighting as a gladiator in arenas. In the rebellion, he started in 73 before Christ. With other slaves he gathered around himself, he had defeated 2 separate Roman armies. By 71 before Christ, Marcus Crassus, assigned by the Senate, managed to defeat Spartacus. Pompey had finished his campaign in Hispania at this time and was returning to Rome. During this return, he came across 5,000 rebels fleeing from Spartacus's army, captured them, and had them killed. Pompey, in the letter he wrote to the Senate after this victory, expressed that Crassus had defeated the rebels, but he himself had solved the problem at its root. Thanks to this, Pompey would become the party collecting all praise in a war he was included in by chance. When he returned to Rome, he was met with a grand ceremony and the public's love. Being the person who both put an end to the rebellion in Hispania and finished the slave uprising started by Spartacus turned him into a hero in the eyes of the public. By 67 before Christ, Rome faced a major danger. This danger before Rome, which owed its livelihood and economy in large proportion to trade, was the pirates in the Mediterranean. These pirates had brought trade in the Mediterranean to a standstill. Because merchant ships did not reach Rome, wheat could not be imported, and consequently, bread prices had hit the ceiling. Thereupon, the Roman Senate assigned Pompey to stop piracy activities in the Mediterranean. Pompey first divided the Mediterranean into 13 regions and sent a fleet to each region. Setting off himself, he reached Cilicia, where pirates were located most densely. Within 40 days, the western parts of the Mediterranean had been cleared of pirates. In the east, a group of pirates united and came face to face with Pompey's navy off Alania. However, these too were defeated. Thus, Pompey, in just 3 months, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, accomplishing another important success. In the same year, Pompey was assigned by the Senate to fight against King Mithridates VI of Pontus. He came face to face with Mithridates' army on the bank of the Lycus River. The gain of the battle fought was Pompey's. Mithridates, after this defeat, fled to Crimea and, advancing in the west direction, tried to gather the tribes on the Danube River to attack Rome. However, his reluctant soldiers and his son would bring his end. Thus, the kingdom of Pontus was seized by Rome. Pompey, after ensuring order here, returned to Rome in 61 before Christ. At this time, anxiety was dominant in the Senate. The reason for this anxiety was the possibility of Pompey entering Rome with his soldiers after the victory he won and taking over the administration. However, Pompey was not going to do this. After discharging his soldiers, he would enter Rome. Instead, he requested his soldiers be rewarded with lands in return for their services. Senate representatives rewarded Pompey's victory, but they rejected the land request, because accepting this request meant the acceptance of Pompey's superior position by the Senate. Although Pompey tried to avoid looking like a seeker of power, he could not escape being seen by the Senate as a man with the potential to destroy the Republic. Thereupon, he decided to take political measures against the Senate. For this purpose, acting together with Crassus and Caesar, he established an alliance in 60 before Christ. Crassus was Rome's wealthiest man. Caesar was a general beginning to shine with the victories he obtained in Hispania. When these three men joined their power, they possessed a power above the authority of the Senate. Following the establishment of the alliance, they divided Rome under their administration. The administration of Syria was given to Crassus, Gaul to Caesar, and Hispania to Pompey. Thanks to this alliance, Caesar was elected consul in 59 before Christ. As we saw earlier, Pompey had requested land from the Senate for his soldiers, but this request had been rejected. Now, thanks to this alliance, he managed to get this request accepted, which he could not get accepted by the Senate before. In addition to this, laws to help poor families with many children could also be passed through the Senate. It was normally impossible for the Senate to accept these laws because this situation did not align with the interests of Senate members. However, this alliance established among Rome's three most powerful men allowed them to pass these laws. Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia in the same year to strengthen the alliance between them. This marriage strengthened the bonds between the pair. However, Julia died during childbirth in the 5th year of the marriage. Her death caused the severing of the bonds holding the Republic on its feet. Caesar, at the time Julia died, was conducting the British campaign. He had seized all of Gaul, and his fame was increasing day by day. He owed reaching this power in large proportion to the triple alliance he established with Crassus and Pompey. However, with Julia's death, the alliance based on family bonds between him and Pompey had weakened. Pompey had also begun to see Caesar as a rival after his conquest of Gaul. With Julia's death, he felt no need to maintain the alliance between them. Just 1 year after Julia's death, that is, in 53 before Christ, Crassus, one of the legs of the Triple Alliance, was killed during a campaign he conducted against the Parthians. After Crassus's death, the element of balance between Pompey and Caesar disappeared, and the rivalry between the former allies began to increase rapidly. Pompey, to strengthen his hand in this rivalry, decided to stay in Rome instead of going to his assigned post, Hispania. He entered an effort to isolate Caesar in the capital. In addition to this, he aimed to win the public's love by engaging in construction activities. By 52 before Christ, his efforts yielded results. Pompey was elected consul alone for that year. Being elected consul alone in Rome meant possessing almost the authority of a dictator. The Senate had given him these authorities so that he would not try to become a dictator using his power. 149. Before Christ arrived, Caesar's term of duty in the provinces, where he served as governor, expired. The experienced general expected his term of duty to be extended. However, with Pompey's direction, the Senate requested Caesar discharge his armies and return to Rome. This meant Caesar losing all his acquisitions in Gaul. If Caesar accepted this request and discharged his army, he would lose all his power against Pompey. If he did not accept the offer, this time he would be declared a traitor and find himself inside a difficult civil war. Caesar came with his army to the Rubicon River in northern Italy. According to Roman laws, it was illegal for a commander to cross the Rubicon River with his soldiers. The commander crossing this river was declared a public enemy and deemed to have opened war on Rome. However, Caesar thought he was wronged and had reached the conclusion that it was right to seek his rights by entering Rome with his soldiers. For this purpose, crossing the river with the legions under his command, he began advancing toward Rome. Caesar, crossing the Rubicon River with his legions, drove his rivals in the Senate into panic. Pompey was forced to leave Rome and flee to Macedonia without even finding the opportunity to take his treasury. Thanks to this, Caesar entered Rome without facing serious resistance. Later, advancing west, he defeated Pompey's legions in Spain and seized the region. Meanwhile, Pompey, in Macedonia, had increased the strength of his army by joining with countless relief forces coming from his allies. Caesar, to fight Pompey, crossed the Ionian Sea with his soldiers in November of 49 before Christ and landed in Epirus. The two armies came face to face in July of 48 before Christ. The winner of this battle, named the Battle of Dyrrhachium, had been Pompey. Following this defeat, Caesar was forced to retreat to Thessaly, where the Battle of Pharsalus would take place. At the end of the battle, Pompey fled, and Caesar won a magnificent victory. Pompey, despite losing the battle, had no intention of accepting defeat. Leaving the battlefield, he reached Egypt by sea route. Here he hoped to receive the pharaoh's support against Caesar. However, things were not going to go as Pompey expected. Egypt's 14-year-old pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, had Pompey killed to win Caesar's gratitude, and had his head severed and mummified to present as a gift to Caesar. Pompey's life had ended in this manner. Caesar, hearing of his death, would be angry at the pharaoh for having him killed out of the respect he felt for Pompey, and supporting Cleopatra against the pharaoh would cause the Egyptian throne to change hands. Pompey, thanks to the victories he won over the years, rose in Roman politics and managed to become the most powerful man in Rome for a period. However, he was never content with what he achieved. He always desired to reach more. This desire brought him face to face with another ambitious Roman, namely Julius Caesar. Pompey was at least as talented and successful as Caesar. In the war he entered with Caesar, he had come very close to winning, but being defeated at Pharsalus would cause the most known name in Roman history to be Julius Caesar, not Pompeius Magnus. Despite this, Pompey managed to write his name in history books with the victories he won. When Augustus was born, his given name was Gaius Octavius. Although he was Caesar's grandnephew on his mother's side, when Caesar was killed in 44 before Christ, he did not possess any power or authority. Caesar had announced in his will that he chose him as his heir and adopted son. However, this situation did not mean Octavius would hold any post in Rome. Following Caesar's death, there were many people wanting to fill the void formed in the capital of the empire, and no one gave probability to Octavius taking Caesar's place. But Octavius would not give up on reaching the position he thought was his right, no matter what. And overcoming the obstacles placed before him one by one, he would become the sole ruler of the Roman Republic. Not content with this, he would transform the Republic into an empire and manage to possess power and authority even greater than Caesar's. To examine more closely how Octavius achieved all this, we need to go to 63 before Christ, to the heart of the Republic, that is, to Rome. Octavius was born near Rome in 63 before Christ. His father gave him his own name, Gaius Octavius. His mother Aetia was the daughter of Julia, the sister of Julius Caesar. In the year Octavius was born, Caesar had been elected as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priesthood post of the Roman state religion. From this moment on, Caesar, climbing the turbulent political steps of Rome one by one, was declared dictator for life by the Senate when 44 before Christ arrived. Until that day in Rome, no one had reached the authority Caesar held and the power he possessed. However, some of Caesar's activities disturbed certain Senate members, including his adopted son Marcus Junius Brutus. This disturbance, felt against Caesar's rise, caused him to be killed as a result of an assassination in March of 44 before Christ. The Senate members organizing this assassination hoped that following Caesar's death, the Roman Republic would return to its old order, and that they would receive appreciation for saving the Republic from a dictator like Caesar. However, the Roman public and a large portion of Roman statesmen did not hold the same thought with them. Caesar was a highly popular and beloved figure in Rome. He had won the public's love by spending a significant portion of his wealth on entertainment and shows organized in the capital. In addition to this, thanks to the lands he conquered, he had turned into a hero in the eyes of Romans. Marcus Antonius, one of Caesar's generals and his close friend, incited the public against Caesar's killers in the speech he made at Caesar's funeral, causing the anger felt toward them to flare up. Following this speech, most of Caesar's killers, realizing they could not reside in Rome, were forced to flee the city. Caesar, because he had no legitimate children, announced in his will that he adopted his grandnephew Octavius as his son and heir. However, Antonius, using the power he obtained thanks to his closeness to Caesar, would take the path of spending this wealth in line with his own interests. Octavius, whom Caesar designated as his heir, was only 19 years old at that time. He was receiving military training in Illyria, together with the legions Caesar selected for the Parthian campaign he planned to organize. After a while, he had been informed of Caesar's death and his will. Now he had to decide what he needed to do. He could take head of the military units in Illyria and try to take Caesar's revenge, but this was a highly risky move. Instead, he could go to Rome and try to get the inheritance set aside for him by Caesar, or he could reject Caesar's inheritance and continue his ordinary life. Octavius did not want to make an early move. Therefore, he thought it would be more suitable to first go to Rome and see closely what the situation was. For this purpose, crossing the Adriatic Sea, he reached Italy. Here he was met with great joy by the public and many soldiers supporting Caesar. Thereupon, he decided to undertake Caesar's inheritance and changed his name to Gaius Julius Caesar. This behavior enabled many soldiers and Caesar supporters to join him. Moving together with the support he acquired, Octavius eventually reached Rome. Here he requested from Antonius the inheritance left for him by Caesar. Although Octavius had received the support of a section consisting of Caesar's supporters as an ordinary citizen, he actually had no authority in Rome. Antonius, on the other hand, had no intention of surrendering Caesar's wealth to this 19-year-old child who had no authority or power. Therefore, he rejected Octavius's request by presenting various excuses. 1 month after Caesar's death in April, Marcus Junius Brutus and Cassius, among Caesar's killers, realizing they could no longer reside in Italy, left the region. While Brutus retreated to Greece, Cassius went to Syria and, with the help of his influence here, managed to build himself an army. Meanwhile, Antonius's activities aimed at increasing his power in Rome and the fact that he had still not taken Caesar's revenge were causing him to fall from favor day by day. Antonius, in this situation, thought possessing political immunity would be beneficial. However, to possess immunity, he needed to be appointed to the governorship of a province. For this reason, he requested from the Senate to be appointed as governor to the province of Cisalpine Gaul. Antonius had chosen this province because of its location close to Rome. Thus, he would not move far from Rome and would be able to maintain the pressure he established over the Senate. However, before this, there was a problem he needed to solve. Cisalpine Gaul was under the administration of Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, and Decimus had no intention of giving control of this place to Antonius. If Antonius could defeat Decimus's soldiers and seize administration of the region, he thought he could prove his power to the Senate and his rivals. For this purpose, setting off together with the soldiers under his command, he besieged Decimus in the city of Mutina. Although the Senate requested the siege be lifted from Antonius, he rejected this and maintained the siege. Thereupon, Senate members appointed Octavius as senator and gave him command authority. The young senator was expected to prevent this operation Antonius engaged in. The young senator, setting off together with the soldiers under his command for this purpose, reached Mutina. In the battle fought in April of 43 before Christ, both sides suffered heavy losses, and Antonius was eventually forced to lift the siege to avoid suffering more losses. However, there was not only enmity in the fates of Antonius and Octavius. Just 5 months after the Battle of Mutina, in October, Antonius Octavius and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus established a triple alliance named the Second Triumvirate, creating 3 new posts possessing unlimited authorities. Their goal in making this agreement was to put an end to the rivalry among Caesar's supporters. Thus, they would be able to focus on taking revenge on Caesar's killers, which was their real target. In this period, Sextus Pompeius, located in Sicily, had launched a rebellion. Sextus was the son of Caesar's rival Pompeius Magnus. Pompeius Magnus, after being defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, where he came face to face with him, had taken refuge in Egypt, but was killed here by the pharaoh's men. Sextus's brother Gnaeus Pompeius was defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Munda, fought in Spain, and was executed after being tried in the Roman Senate on charges of treason. Sextus, managing to flee after this battle, had gone to Sicily. Now he was in a state of rebellion against Rome. This rebellion in Sicily needed to be quelled. However, the main target of Caesar's supporters was Caesar's killers Cassius and Brutus. Their priority would be to march upon them. Thanks to this, Sextus found the opportunity to use the shores of the island of Sicily to increase the strength of his army and form a powerful navy. In October 42 before Christ, the winner of the Battle of Philippi fought between Caesar's supporters and Caesar's killers was Caesar's supporters. Brutus and Cassius, following the defeat they suffered, ended their own lives. After this victory, the Roman Republic was divided into 3 administrative parts, such that Octavius would rule the region from Illyria to Spain, Antonius the region from Macedonia to Palestine, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Africa. Italy, on the other hand, was declared an independent region. However, due to its proximity to the region, Italy was actually under Octavius's control. An environment of peace seemed to be re-established in Rome. However, Sicily was still in Sextus's hands. The leader of the rebels had formed a large navy while the civil war continued, and this situation had put him in a position more dangerous than before. Sextus, completing his preparations, took action in 40 before Christ, and thanks to this navy he formed, seized the islands of Sardinia and Corsica. The loss of these islands around Italy had caused a major security deficit in Rome. Octavius was aware that he needed to put an end to this situation and secure Rome. However, his army had not long emerged from war, and his soldiers were reluctant. In addition to this, he did not possess a navy of sufficient size either. Antonius, because he was preparing for the Parthian campaign, did not want to deal with Sextus on the island of Sicily. Because of all these reasons, Octavius decided to make a peace agreement with Sextus. In the peace made, Sextus's dominance over the islands of Sardinia and Corsica was recognized, and in addition to this, control of the Peloponnese Peninsula was transferred to him. While these were experienced in the west, in the east, Antonius was in search of allies for the campaign he would make against the Parthians. For this purpose, he invited Caesar's former lover, Cleopatra, to Tarsus. Here, negotiations that initially began for the purpose of military aid gradually reached a different dimension. At the end of the negotiation, Antonius had fallen in love with Cleopatra. Following this meeting in the same year, Cleopatra invited Antonius to Alexandria this time. The two lovers found the opportunity to spend more time here, and the following year, they had twin babies, 1 girl and 1 boy. During this relationship, Antonius was actually married, but while he was with Cleopatra, his wife Fulvia died. Following Fulvia's death, they had planned to marry Cleopatra. However, a move coming from Octavius was going to drop their plans into water. Upon Fulvia's death, Octavius requested Antonius marry his own sister Octavia. Antonius, although he planned to marry Cleopatra, was forced to accept this offer, for if he rejected the offer, he could cause the newly established alliance to disperse. In these years, Sextus took action again and began organizing raids on Italy. Not content with this, thanks to the superiority he established on the seas, he was preventing merchant ships going to Rome. This situation had caused a food crisis in Rome. Octavius, to put an end to this, made an attempt to seize Sicily in 37 before Christ. But this attempt resulted in failure. Octavius's navy retreated after being defeated at the Battle of Messina. Sextus's navy was superior to Octavius's navy, and for Octavius to land on the island of Sicily, he needed to defeat this navy. But doing this with his existing power was quite difficult. That is why he made the decision to ask for help from Antonius, whom he had married to his sister Octavia. As a result of negotiations mediated by Octavia, Antonius agreed to send ships and soldiers to Octavius. With incoming reinforcement forces, Octavius decided to attack Sextus again in 36 before Christ. The navy commanded by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, one of his trusted commanders, defeated Sextus's navy at the Battle of Nolocus. Following this victory, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, administrator of African lands, also made a landing on Sicily and seized many important settlements. Lepidus wanted to take over administration of the lands remaining from Sextus. However, his soldiers had no intention of fighting Agrippa's soldiers, and an important section of these soldiers deserted and joined Agrippa's army. Following this event, all authorities were taken from Lepidus's hands, and his lands in Africa fell into Octavius's hands. Now the Roman Republic was ruled not by a powerful alliance, but by 2 men holding all authorities in their hands. This situation over time would cause the rivalry between these 2 men to increase and prepare the ground for a new power struggle. When the late summer of 34, before Christ arrived, Marcus Antonius decided to start the Parthian campaign, for which he had been continuing preparations for a long time. However, this campaign resulted in failure, and Antonius had to return to Egypt empty-handed. This unsuccessful attempt of Antonius caused him to fall from favor in Rome. Octavius, on the other hand, embarked on the Illyrian campaign 1 year after this, and winning victory here increased his popularity in Rome. In addition to this, Octavius did not hesitate to conduct propaganda aimed at reducing Antonius's prestige either, especially his relationship with a non-Roman woman like Cleopatra, while possessing a noble wife, was frequently voiced by him in the Roman Senate, increasing his popularity against Antonius day by day. Antonius, to raise his falling prestige again, organized a Parthian campaign once more, but he returned empty-handed from this campaign as well. Despite this, he did not neglect entering Egypt accompanied by a victory procession. Following victory celebrations, he donated lands to Cleopatra and her children under the name of the Donations of Alexandria. According to this, the east of Libya, Phoenicia, Syria, Cilicia, and Armenia were left to Cleopatra and her children. This action of Antonius was an unmissable cause for war for Octavius, who already wanted to seize control of the lands under his rule. Octavius used this situation to take the support of the Roman Senate as well. He read aloud in the Roman Senate the donations Antonius made to Cleopatra and her children, stating that he was in a desire to leave Rome and establish a new kingdom. Leaving Rome's lands to an Egyptian woman and her children was not something Senate members could accept. Indeed, so it happened. The Senate officially revoked Antonius's consular authorities and passed a war decision against Cleopatra. In the spring of 32 before Christ, Antonius set up camp at Cape Actium with his army and, anchoring his ships in the Gulf of Ambracia, decided to await Octavius's army here. Cleopatra was accompanying him with the soldiers and ships under her command. Octavius won the naval battle of Actium, fought in September of 31 before Christ. Cleopatra and Antonius, following this defeat, were forced to flee to Egypt together with the ships containing treasures. Octavius, pursuing them, besieged Alexandria and managed to seize the city after a resistance of a few months. Following the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antonius ended their lives to avoid falling into Octavius's hands. Octavius, after Antonius's death, became the sole ruler of Rome and was deemed worthy of the title Augustus by the Senate in 27 before Christ. This power he possessed made him the first emperor of Rome. Octavius, on the journey he set off on to take the inheritance left to him by Caesar, reached a power perhaps no one expected from him, a power even Caesar could not reach. Unlike Caesar, throughout his rule, lasting approximately 40 years, he would manage to preserve this power of his, when he died in 14. After Christ, his throne would pass to Tiberius, his adopted son and heir. Thus, Rome would transform into an empire ruled by a monarchy. Having briefly mentioned Augustus, we can now enter the golden age of Roman history, namely Pax Romana. Let us start explaining everything with a simple question. Suppose we possess the world's largest army. We open the map before us. From the misty forests of Britain to the scorching deserts of Egypt, from the shores of Spain to the heart of Anatolia, everywhere is under our control. So how will we keep this massive geography in our hands? Merely with brute force? By posting soldiers on every corner? In such a situation, pure muscle power and violence serve our purpose up to a point, don't they? Brute force enables us to conquer, yes, but it does not enable us to be permanent. This is precisely where that great breaking point created in history by Augustus, Caesar's adopted son, begins. Augustus, when he took power, aimed to connect the places taken so far to one another rather than expanding the state's borders. Roman legions were the deadliest, most disciplined war machine history had seen up to that day. However, when entering the Pax Romana period, the sole tool in the hands of soldiers was no longer that famous short sword, namely their gladius. Do you know what it was? A pickaxe, yes, in Roman terms, a delabra, and a surveying instrument called a groma. Before this, too, Romans had actually shown great development in the field of engineering. Legions did not merely fight, they also built the bridges that made the conquest of Gaul possible. For example, in 55 before Christ, Caesar had built a bridge approximately 200 meters wide in a short time, like 10 days to cross the Rhine River. However, in the Pax Romana period, the Roman army virtually turned into the world's largest construction company. When the Civil War ended with Augustus's Actium victory in 31 before Christ, legions did not withdraw to their barracks and sleep. Taking pickaxes and shovels in hand, they bored through mountains, drained marshes, and began building one of the most magnificent logistics networks history had seen, Roman roads. There's a reason why even today we say all roads lead to Rome. We are talking about a network of 400,000 kilometers in total, with 80,000 kilometers being stone-paved main arteries. Let me express how magnificent a length this is. This length means going around the world exactly 10 times. But why? Why did they go to so much trouble? Because Augustus's, and consequently Rome's, mind made all calculations over that massive map. Did a rebellion break out? The transit time that would normally last for months dropped to weeks thanks to these roads. Are taxes to be collected? Are merchants to carry goods? Are orders to be conveyed? All advanced rapidly thanks to these roads. Thanks to the state postal organization they named Cursus Publicus, an emperor's sealed order reached even the furthest borders rapidly by covering 80 kilometers a day. The Roman Empire used these roads like political tendons. It pacified rebellious tribes not by shedding blood, but by making them dependent on this system, because these roads did not carry only soldiers, they also carried culture, comfort, and trade. What Rome brought to the lands it conquered was not merely law. It was clean water brought by massive aqueducts. It was underfloor heated baths and theaters where the public socialized. As a result of this, Germanic tribal leaders, instead of living in the forest, began preferring to live like Roman governors wearing togas and sipping their wine. Here lay the secret of Pax Romana. Instead of forcing people to obey you, making them desire to be like you. Well, was this massive assimilation wheel going to turn solely with stone, road, and bath? How were they going to melt millions of people speaking dozens of different languages and believing in hundreds of different gods in a single pot? Now, let us try to answer these questions. Augustus, when he looked at that map we mentioned, also saw these. In the north, warlike Celts. In the east, ancient Egyptians. Greeks boasting of their philosophy, Syrians and Iberians. Millions of people speaking completely different languages from one another, believing in entirely different gods, possessing different backgrounds. You cannot connect this massive population to one another merely with stone roads. You need to connect minds to one another as well. Here, the second great network Rome built was Latin and Roman law, consisting of words and rules. Rome never opened direct war on the religion or culture of people in places it occupied. Instead of destroying temples, it preferred to place its own gods beside theirs. In addition to this, with a much smarter move, it offered them the most attractive proposal the world had seen up to that day: Roman citizenship. Becoming a Roman citizen meant separating oneself suddenly from an ordinary peasant or barbarian. It meant not being whipped unjustly, being able to trade, acquiring property, meaning being under guarantee before Roman law. Even Paul of Tarsus, one of Christianity's most important figures, used this right of his when arrested and was able to appeal directly to the emperor. As in that legendary saying of the famous Roman orator Cicero, the sentence civis Romanus sum, meaning I am a Roman citizen, was the strongest armor a person could wear on themselves in that period. But wearing this armor had a price, speaking the system's language, namely Latin. Rome presented its own language and law as an opportunity. If you were born in a remote Gallic village and did not want to die of hunger, if you wanted to become wealthy, rise politically, or merely sell your goods safely, you had to learn Latin, because court records, merchant contracts, tax plaques, assignment orders, all of these were in Latin. In other words, after Roman intellect completed the physical conquest with its legions, it started the real permanent occupation in minds. With a shared language and a universal legal system, it transformed dozens of different nations into a massive marketplace, obeying the same rules and using the same money, namely the Roman denarius. The system was working like clockwork. War had ended inside the borders, trade had boomed, the economy had soared. Peace was erected right in the middle of the Mediterranean like a marble statue. However, shadows inevitably fall on certain areas of every flawless statue. What was the price of this splendid Roman peace? How was this massive wheel actually turning? Now is the time to speak of these. When we say peace today, we visualize an environment where violence has completely vanished in our eyes. Yet for Romans, pax, meaning peace, was not the end of violence. It meant the monopolization of violence, meaning only and solely the state possessing the right to apply violence. If you obeyed the rules while inside the system, yes, life was beautiful. Theaters, baths, safe roads were at your service. But if you demanded your old culture, your independence, or if you made a tiny uprising against this flawless system, that civilized face of Rome would suddenly vanish. The Roman historian Tacitus, while relating the speech made by Calgacus, leader of the Caledonian resistance, to his soldiers during the occupation of Britain, records these magnificent words that went down in history. They plunder, they slaughter, they usurp, and under a false name they call it empire. They create a desolate desert and call it peace. Here was precisely the real face of Pax Romana on borderlines. To ensure the security of those peaceful, marble-paved streets inside, an uninterrupted terror was applied beyond the borders and upon those who resisted. Well, were those safe regions inside the borders where trade soared and law worked, which we praised so much, truly that innocent and peaceful? Beneath this 200-year golden age, beneath those massive aqueducts, roads, and temples, lay another invisible foundation: slavery. According to historians Bruce Fryer and Keith Hopkins, around the 1st century after Christ, Rome's population was around 45 to 60 million. Almost 8 to 10 million of this consisted of slaves. What we call Roman peace was actually built upon the desperation of these millions of slaves. Furthermore, Roman intellect read social psychology very well. Populations fighting and shedding blood for centuries, when suddenly entering a peace environment, needed to transfer that aggressive energy inside them to another place. What could be done so people would not rebel against the state and not be overly interested in politics? The answer was hidden inside architectural genius again, in the Colosseum, and in amphitheaters spread to all four corners of the empire. With that famous observation of the famous Roman poet Juvenal, panem et circenses, meaning bread and circuses. The Roman state distributed free wheat to the public to prevent a possible rebellion and presented them with bloody gladiator fights in massive arenas. That desire inside people to fight, shed blood, and establish dominance was discharged in a controlled manner by making them watch from the stands. While you sat safely in the stands, watching someone die brutally in the arena, the state was actually whispering this to your subconscious. Look, there is death outside. There is chaos. Stay inside this peace I provided. Eat your free bread and enjoy the show. In summary, Pax Romana was not a utopia where swords did not come out of scabbards. It was a flawless example of administration where only a single center decided whose throat swords would be pressed against. A massive golden cage where freedom and will were surrendered completely to the state in return for security. Rome was undoubtedly one of the largest empires history had seen. By around the year 1 after Christ, Roman emperors ruled a massive area extending from Britain to Egypt, from Anatolia to Spain. In these years, 1 in every 5 people living on Earth maintained their life within empire borders. Rome played host to many cultures and beliefs. When passing from one city to another, culture, belief, religious rituals, and even worshipped gods could change. Right in this period, a new belief found life in Rome's Judea province and slowly began spreading within the borders of the empire. This belief was Christianity. How Christianity emerged and began spreading was covered in the previous section. In this section, we will speak about how the Roman Empire became Christian. But before this, it is useful to touch upon Rome's attitude toward early Christians, because this religious transition process was not something that happened and finished all at once. We are in 64 after Christ. On the night of July 19th, a jet-black smoke cloud rises over the buildings around Circus Maximus, Rome's stadium famous for chariot races. The cause of this smoke cloud is a fire that started in one of the shops and continues to grow by jumping to nearby buildings. Within a few hours, a large portion of the city will remain in flames. This is one of the greatest disasters the city of Rome has seen, the Great Fire of Rome. Extinguishing the Great Fire of Rome, which started on the night of July 19th, had taken 6 days. Although the flames subsided at the end of 6 days, this situation did not mean the disaster had ended, because Romans had not been able to take the fire under control in the full sense. Flames rose again, and after this, the city continued to burn for 3 more days. When everything ended, damage was at a massive level. Alongside centuries-old structures being leveled to the ground, 2/3 of the city had also vanished. Today, there's no record that has reached our hands regarding how this fire broke out. Probably Nero, the emperor of the period, did not possess such information either. But to escape responsibility for the fire, he needed a scapegoat. This scapegoat would be Christians. In the process prior to the fire, there are records claiming 2 of the most important figures in Christian history were in Rome. The first of these was Peter, one of Jesus' most important apostles. The other was Paul, whom we frequently mentioned in the previous section. It is difficult to reach a general conclusion as to why Nero blamed Christians. Had he felt disturbance from Christians due to the sermons they gave? Was he blaming them for this reason? Or had Christians really set the fire, or had some Roman politicians caused Nero to think this way? All of these are within probability. Consequently, Nero placed responsibility for this fire upon Christians, and for the first time in Roman history, a general persecution began against Christians. Everyone identified as having adopted Jesus' teaching was caught, subjected to heavy punishments, and killed. Among these were Peter and Paul, who held great importance for Christians. Approximately 35 years after all these experiences, the famous Roman historian Tacitus recorded these events. Had it not been for what he wrote, our information on this topic would have been much more limited. By the time of the period Tacitus lived in, namely the end of the 1st century after Christ, Rome was not applying a persecution policy against Christians. Actually, this policy flared up in some periods and subsided in some periods. Prosecutions applied to Christians were generally regional, and this continued until approximately the middle of the 3rd century. However, with Emperor Decius, who reigned between 249 and 251 after Christ, things began to change. Decius was a man devoted to the Roman religion and wanted citizens living within empire borders to show this devotion as well. Therefore, he passed some laws making animal sacrifice to pagan gods mandatory. Officials documented animals, people sacrificed with receipts made of papyrus and gave these receipts to their owners. Those who did not possess these receipts and refused to offer sacrifices to gods could be arrested and killed. Decius had not targeted Christians specifically when passing this law. In other words, people subjected to prosecution, caught and killed were not only Christians. Pagans neglecting to offer sacrifices to gods also received their share from this law. But Emperor Valerian, who reigned between 253 and 260, had Christians specifically in his target. Valerian passed a series of laws in 257 involving the removal from office of senators who refused to comply with the law and the execution of those persistent in this attitude of theirs. 1 year after this, he had leading names of Christians executed. Assets of civil servants who were Christian were confiscated, and each was sent into exile. However, the largest persecution conducted systematically against Christians within Roman borders began in 303 after Christ, during the time of Emperor Diocletian. According to the law passed by Diocletian, Christian books and places of worship within the empire would be destroyed. Furthermore, Christians gathering together for worship was also forbidden. All bishops and priests would be arrested. If they agreed to offer sacrifice, which was seen as a sign of giving up Christianity, they would be released. Otherwise, they would be executed. According to modern estimates, as many as 3,500 Christians were killed during this period. Others, far greater in number, were tortured and imprisoned. During the Diocletianic period, the persecution policy applied against Christians had reached its absolute peak. However, this situation was not going to last very long. At this point, opening a small parenthesis, it is also necessary to touch briefly upon the political situation of the Roman Empire in that period. The 3rd century for the empire was a period of non-stop crisis. Historians also name this section of empire history the crisis of the 3rd century. In this period, Rome faced many negatives such as internal turmoil, wars, famine, and disease. Frequent emperor changes were experienced. However, Diocletian, after ascending the throne, reshaped Rome's political structure. The new management model he adopted was the tetrarchy, that is, rule of 4. According to this system, the empire was ruled simultaneously by 4 emperors in total, 2 senior and 2 junior. Diocletian had put this model into practice to make the expanded empire borders more easily manageable. One of these co-emperors was Constantius I, who administered the regions of Gaul, Spain, and Britain. When Constantius was killed near York during a war fought against the Picts in 306. After Christ, soldiers declared his son Constantine emperor. However, Constantine II, just like his father, became one of the co-emperors ruling Rome. By 312, Rome was ruled by 4 different emperors. Constantine ruled the lands of Gaul, Spain, and Britain. Maxentius ruled Italy and northwest Africa. Licinius ruled the province of Pannonia and the Balkans. Maximinus Daza ruled the region of northeast Africa, along with Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. However, this co-rule idea built by Diocletian was not going to be long-lasting. On October 28, 312, the armies of Constantine and Maxentius came face-to-face at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The winner of the battle was Constantine. Maxentius was killed, and the lands belonging to him were annexed by Constantine. However, narratives emerging later regarding this battle would load a religious meaning onto the battle alongside its political importance. We have 2 different sources regarding this topic. The first of these is Constantine's court bishop Eusebius. According to Eusebius, Constantine had seen in his dream before the battle a cross appearing with the text, "In this sign you will conquer," written upon it. According to another source, Lactantius, what Constantine saw in his dream were the letters Chi and Rho. These were the first 2 letters of the Greek word for Christ. But Constantine had these letters embroidered onto soldiers' standards and shields before the battle, and according to Lactantius, won the battle in this manner. This event can essentially be accepted as the symbolic beginning of emperors' acceptance of Christianity. But in reality, the adoption of Christianity was probably related to Constantine's policies rather than a dream. Over the years, Christianity had continued to spread within empire borders. Aramaic-speaking populations in the east had adopted Christianity. In Alexandria, the number of Christians was increasing with every passing day. By Constantine's period, 1 in every 10 people living within empire borders had become Christian. In addition to this, in 301, the Kingdom of Armenia had also accepted Christianity as its official religion. So, what were the factors enabling the spread of Christianity within Roman borders? Now let us try to evaluate this topic. Ancient Rome was an extremely religious society. Religious and political posts within the empire were generally intertwined. For example, Julius Caesar had served as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, before being elected consul. This situation over time paved the way for emperors to gain divine qualities as well. Emperors were deified by the Senate after their deaths. Temples were built for them, and sacrifices were offered in their names. Furthermore, after state borders began to expand, Romans began constantly encountering new beliefs and gods. In some cases, they included these new gods they encountered into their own beliefs as well. In other words, Romans' pantheon of gods both changed regionally and possessed considerable diversity. Looked at from this perspective, we can see Romans were accustomed to the idea of a new god. This exact situation played a major role in empire citizens accepting Christianity. for a large portion of Romans saw no problem in accepting Jesus as a new God as well. Another factor accelerating the spread of Christianity was related to the teaching itself, eternal life and the forgiveness of sins. These two ideas had drawn the attention especially of people living in the lower stratum of society. They had a difficult life, and there was no guarantee whether they could pull through the next day. Rome's old pagan religion was not enough to keep these people's beliefs alive. In contrast, Christianity promised them hope and salvation. These promises enabled Christianity to spread rapidly, especially among poor people. Other factors triggering the spread of Christianity were these. During the crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman government suffered a heavy blow and institutions began to corrupt. Rome remained inadequate in conveying necessary help to poor people. Christians, during these turbulent years, gained many converts by presenting various aids to the poor. Furthermore, some tax reforms made during Emperor Diocletian's time led to cuts in allowances of Roman religious sects. In other words, sects supported by the state were now struggling to find money to reach the public and help them. Christian sects would begin taking their place over time. Another factor was that Rome's traditional religion did not possess a centralized structure. In Roman religion, many gods and many beliefs were intertwined. People even in houses in the same neighborhood believed in different gods and applied different religious rituals. This situation was quite complex for many people. In contrast, Christianity presented a more focused and tidy belief system. Here, Emperor Constantine was closely following all these developments experienced within empire borders. His goal was to unite the empire politically. Sidelining Maxentius, one of his rivals, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he took the first step necessary for this policy of his. Sidelining Maximinus Daza in 313 and Licinius in 324, he would become emperor alone. However, Constantine believed what would guarantee Rome's political integrity was social and cultural integrity. Rome's traditional religion did not possess a fully consistent structure even within itself, and did not appeal to every section of society. Christianity, on the other hand, possessed a more understandable and clear message. For this reason, Constantine thought Christianity could possess a unifying effect. And with the Edict of Milan, he issued in 313 together with co-emperor Licinius, he initiated the process that would accelerate the spread of this religion. The Edict of Milan was a turning point in Roman history. The edict granted freedom to all beliefs located within the borders of the Roman Empire. Now the persecution policy would end completely. People would be able to comfortably say they were Christian. Furthermore, Constantine financially supported the church throughout his life, built basilicas, gave specific privileges, such as exemption from certain taxes to clergy, appointed Christians to high posts, and returned properties confiscated during the long persecution period to their owners. The Council of Nicaea, held in 325, where the foundations of Christianity were determined, convened under Constantine's leadership again. All these developments played an important role in Christianity becoming the dominant religion within Rome. In other words, one of the most important reasons for Rome's rapid Christianization during this process was Constantine's moderate approach toward Christians. Well, was Constantine himself truly a Christian? This topic continues to be debated even today. According to some historians, Constantine had used this religion, which he thought would possess a unifying effect, to realize his own policies. To determine whether Constantine was a faithful Christian or not, one needs to take these into consideration. The Edict of Milan had made Christianity a legal religion, but all local beliefs in the Roman Empire also continued, meaning Constantine had not issued an edict banning or restricting other religions. The Arch of Constantine, built in 315 after Christ, lacked Christian symbols and contained statues making offerings to Apollo, Diana, and Hercules. Throughout Constantine's reign, the sun god Sol Invictus draws attention as the figure most frequently seen on coins. We know this figure was closely related to Constantine's family cult. However, if Constantine were a faithful Christian, he would probably prevent such figures from taking place on coins and use the cross or Chi-Rho signs that were claimed to have won him the battle at the Milvian Bridge. Constantine did not announce he was a Christian until the last moment and was baptized only on his deathbed. Finally, Constantine's mother, Helena, was a Christian, and Constantine had learned many things regarding Christianity from her. In other words, his sympathy toward Christianity was closely related to this topic. Taking all these into consideration, it is quite difficult to claim Constantine was a faithful Christian. However, we can comfortably say he was one of the most important figures enabling the spread of Christianity during his period and after. In the process, after Constantine's death, Christianity continued to spread in the Roman Empire. From this period onward, all emperors except Julian, whom Roman Christian historians characterized as the apostate, were Christian. And finally, with the Edict of Thessalonica, issued by Theodosius I in 380, Christianity became the official religion of Rome. At first, Theodosius felt no need to take any measure against pagans. Their temples were open, and they continued to maintain their beliefs. But several edicts issued by Theodosius, starting from 391, reversed the persecution policy once applied. Paganism was banned, temples were closed, and assets of pagans began to be confiscated. This situation, finding a major response in the eyes of the public, caused events to spiral out of control. Those attacking or interfering with pagans were not only empire officials. The Christian public had also begun attacking pagan temples. Today, when you visit a museum, you can see the heads, arms, or legs of some statues are broken or shattered. A large section of these actually carries the traces of those days, because Christians shattered statues located in pagan temples and threw them into deep places nearby, such as seas, rivers, and wells. Rome's traditional religion had now become its greatest enemy. Beginning with Constantine, Christianity had begun spreading rapidly. With the ban of paganism in 391, Rome's Christianization process was largely completed. Pagan beliefs and rituals continued to live within empire borders, but the number of those keeping them alive was now quite few. The empire now had to deal with another problem, for in Theodosius's period, Rome was under attack from many directions. The migration carried out by the Huns from the vast steppes of Asia toward Eastern Europe was about to change Europe's political structure. The empire would be forced to open its borders to tribes it characterized as barbarian, and all of these were pagan. In earlier sections, we saw that the most important condition to join the Roman army was Roman citizenship. But this condition could be ignored in the first century before Christ, especially in situations where the need for soldiers increased. For example, Caesar formed an entire legion from Gauls. These even received state support over time in return for the service they displayed. In addition to this, some allied kings organized their own armies in the form of Roman legions as well. In the army of King Juba of Numidia, there were 4 legions, and in the army of King Diotris of Galatia, there were 2 legions. Galatian legions were later combined, taking the name of the 22nd Deiotariana Legion and becoming a part of the Roman army. Throughout history, as in all armies, unit strengths in theory were rarely reflected in the field in the Roman army as well. As we will remember from the previous section, cohorts theoretically consisted of 480 soldiers. In contrast, at the Battle of Pharsalus occurring in 48 before Christ, the number of soldiers in Pompey's cohorts was 400. On the other hand, in Caesar's Egyptian campaign, this number was even lower. Casualties given during the Civil War had reduced the number of one of Caesar's legions down to 1,000 soldiers. In such situations where the strength of the army decreased, the importance of allied units increased. Romans called these units auxilia. They were usually formed with soldiers procured from Gauls, Thracians, and Germanic peoples. The most known among these was the Batavi tribe, settled on the bank of the Rhine River. The Batavi did not pay taxes to the empire. Instead, they sent large quantities of soldiers to the army. According to Tacitus's records, the number of soldiers taken from this tribe reached up to 5,000 from time to time. This meant a legion could be formed solely with the force provided by the Batavi. Allies initially served in legions deployed close to their homelands, but some rebellions breaking out in the imperial period caused this practice to be changed, especially from 70. After Christ onward, allies began serving in different regions of the empire. In the Roman army, in addition to auxilia units, mercenaries named numeri also served. These, just like auxilia units, were citizens of allied states, but unlike them, joining the army was not mandatory for them. They did this job for money. Allied units joined the Roman army in 2 different ways: infantry and cavalry. Because legions were massive war machines consisting of foot soldiers, auxilia and numeri units consisting especially of cavalry held vital importance for the Roman army. Balearic slingers, Cretan archers, and Numidian cavalry taking place in the Republic army would be the most used auxiliary units in the imperial period as well. The Battle of Actium, taking place in 31 before Christ, was the final war of the Roman Republic. 4 years after this, Rome transformed into an empire under Octavian's rule. He was given the titles Augustus and Princeps by the Senate. Caesar's heir climbed political career steps at unexpected speed, becoming the most powerful man in Rome within a few years. However, there were things he needed to do to preserve this power. Augustus realized that the civil war process, lasting for years, was closely related to Rome's dynamic military structure. To ensure peace in the empire, one needed to keep the army under control. Otherwise, legions under the command of rival commanders came face to face with one another, fought, and could even pose a threat to the state's existence. The military reforms Augustus made in the army were aimed at preventing this dilemma that left Rome in a difficult situation from time to time. First, the massive Roman army consisting of 60 legions was reduced to 28 legions, lowering the army's strength. After the Teutoburg Forest battle taking place in 9 after Christ, where Germanic tribes destroyed 3 Roman legions. This number fell to 25 and underwent no change for roughly the next 300 years. In contrast, the number of soldiers taking place in legions was raised, even if slightly. In the previous section, we saw that each legion, excluding auxiliary forces, consisted of 4,920 soldiers. With reforms made in the Augustus period, the strength of the first cohort was raised from 480 to 800. Thus, a legion's total strength reached 5,240 soldiers. This shows that in the Augustus period, the total military force of Roman legions was roughly around 130,000. With the addition of auxiliary forces and mercenaries to these, this number could rise up to 250,000. In addition to this, the emperor created a new rank named praefectus castrorum to benefit from the experiences of soldiers who had served in the army for years. Legion commanders, namely legati, were generally chosen from among aristocrats who had newly become senators. Although possessing brilliant political careers, they were inexperienced militarily. Here, praefectus castrorum, namely camp commanders, was a new position created by Augustus to eliminate this deficit of theirs. The responsibility and command of the camp, logistics, and engineering works, distribution of daily duties among soldiers were under their responsibility. In short, praefectus castrorum was an experienced soldier assisting the inexperienced legion commander in military, technical, and logistical aspects. Augustus knew that to keep the army under control and ensure peace within the country, the loyalty of soldiers needed to be tied to himself, not to legion commanders. Therefore, he engaged in a series of initiatives to improve the conditions of soldiers. Legionnaires' salaries were now covered directly from the treasury belonging to the emperor. Furthermore, salaries were raised and bonuses soldiers would receive after retiring were improved. Before Augustus's reforms, the state gave land to retiring soldiers so they could provide their livelihood in their later life. This practice continued in the imperial period as well. However, soldiers who wished could now receive money instead of land. Such improvements made in legionnaires' salaries and retirement conditions enabled the army's loyalty to be gathered in the person of the emperor. The greatest military reform made in the Augustus period was undoubtedly the establishment of a permanent garrison in Rome, the capital of the empire. Soldiers residing here were guard regiments used by the emperor to deter conspiracies and rebellions and ensure law and order in the city. These were the emperor's closest defense line. They accompanied him when going to the Senate, protected him while sleeping at night, and ensured law and order in the city. Their terms of service and salaries were different from legion soldiers. Guard regiment soldiers were obligated to 16 years of service, whereas legionnaires had to complete 25 years to retire. As of 14, after Christ, the salary of soldiers serving in the guard regiment was determined as 720 denarii. In contrast, the salary legionnaires received in the same period was only 225 denarii. Consequently, legion soldiers looked with envy at guard regiments, but it is useful to state this was not an unfair practice, for guard regiments, alongside ensuring the city's law and order and protecting the emperor, would serve the Roman Empire as elite military units for long years. They participated in many campaigns taking place in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ together with the emperor, and proved repeatedly that they were the most effective unit of the Roman army. Finally, let us take a look at how a Roman legionnaire went through training during recruit period. At the head of factors bringing the Roman army to success undoubtedly came long-term training based on strict discipline. Recruit legionnaires had to enter a mandatory 4-month training. Programs applied in this process aimed to prepare soldiers physically and psychologically for war. Trainings began with military step exercises. First, recruits were made to walk 29 kilometers in quick time for 5 hours. Later, within the same duration, they were asked to walk 35 kilometers with loads of 20.5 kilograms loaded on their backs. Captains or drill sergeants responsible for the company walked beside soldiers with sticks to beat those moving slowly. The next stage was preparation for war. Armed drills were done with wooden swords and spears. In trainings, how to make attacks with a spear or sword while protecting the body effectively, together with a shield, was shown. Furthermore, recruits were also taught swimming. During campaigns, especially if there was no time to build a bridge, soldiers were expected to cross rivers by swimming. In addition to all this, even if cursorily, recruits were also given training on archery, sling usage, and horse riding. Recruits completing these trainings successfully gained the right to join the Roman legion. The 3rd century after Christ was a period where many disasters came one after another for the Roman Empire. Within this century, the empire struggled with internal and external threats, non-stop rebellions, wars, epidemic diseases, and an inflation that would take years to overcome. The Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace, era built starting from Augustus, was now long left behind. This was a century where ambitious politicians and greedy generals dragged the empire virtually to the brink of destruction to rise. In the 49-year period, covering 235 to 284, more than 20 emperors ascended the throne by waging bloody struggles, and again, a large section of these were dethroned in a bloody manner. In earlier sections, we covered how the Roman army constantly developed and transformed into the ancient age's largest war machine. Now it is time to relate how this army lost its prestige and progressively lost power starting from the 3rd century. In the variable and ruthless atmosphere of the 3rd century, emperors were definitely aware of one thing. To hold power, they primarily needed the army's loyalty, and the army's loyalty was closely related to how high the payments soldiers would receive were. In the previous section, we saw that in the Augustus period, legionnaires' salary was 225 denarii. The first salary increase after this was made during the time of Emperor Domitian, who reigned between 81 and 96 after Christ. Domitian raised annual legionnaire payments from 225 denarii to 300 denarii. The salary of soldiers like standard bearers and options, who were higher ranked, was raised to 600, and the salary of centurions, responsible for companies, to 1,200 denarii. After this, for roughly 100 years, there was no change in fees, until Emperor Septimius Severus, who reigned between 193 and 211, made a 50% increase in legionnaire salaries. Thus, the salary of the lowest-ranked legionnaires rose to 450 denarii. Caracalla, ascending the throne after Severus's death, doubled the fee, raising soldiers' salaries to 900 denarii. But the consequences of this move were heavy. This disproportionate increase in soldiers' salaries had begun to wear out the Roman Empire financially. Emperors ascending the throne after Caracalla, although they tried to reduce this fee, were not successful, for every attempt aimed at reducing salaries resulted in legions rebelling. Finally, Maximinus Thrax, ascending the throne in 235, had to double salaries again, raising the fee legionnaires received to exactly 1,800 denarii. But raising salaries this much led to the empire dealing with intense inflation in the remaining section of the 3rd century. To carry out payments, the ratio of silver inside the money distributed to soldiers was reduced, so much so that by 260, the silver ratio inside money was 95% less compared to coins minted in 215. This situation stoked the fire of inflation even further. Prices began to rise at a massive speed. In Emperor Diocletian's period, the price of wheat was 67 times more than it was in the Pax Romana period. In contrast, what increased in the 3rd century was not only salaries and high inflation. In the previous section, we saw that in the 1st century, legionnaires' term of service was limited to 25 years. Soldiers completing 25 years retired and were rewarded with land or a retirement bonus in return for the service they gave. But conditions in the 3rd century were much tougher than in the 1st century. Rebellions and wars could extend soldiers' discharge duration. In 244, soldiers' term of duty was extended by 1 year to 26 years. However, soldiers completing this duration could rarely be discharged. This actually shows that terms of service in this period were longer than this, so much so that by 270, there were many soldiers serving for over 30 years in the Legio II Parthica. When we come to the late Empire period, military service was not seen as an honorable and attractive profession, as in the old days. Replacing deceased senior soldiers was very difficult, and new appointees were forced to start duty without going through adequate training. From period to period, it even happened that finding soldiers to fill lines in legions became difficult. This situation paved the way for a new system over time, allowing the obligation to serve in the army to be transferred from generation to generation. Officers serving in the Roman army were expected to raise their children as soldiers. In addition to this, finding volunteer soldiers was not easy either. To increase participation in the army, large shares from spoils to be gained began to be given to volunteer soldiers. The next step was enlisting slaves into the army. Their numbers were not very many, but this was an application never before seen in empire history. Finding soldiers for the army becoming difficult, and furthermore, found soldiers being far from desired qualities, had increased the importance of allied units in the army. Starting from the 3rd century after Christ, the number of allied units in the Roman army progressively rose. By the 4th century, an important section of Roman legions consisted of soldiers of Germanic origin. Very few of these knew Latin. With the short-term training they received before joining the army, they had the opportunity to know Roman culture cursorily. In other words, by the 4th century, Rome's army had become dependent on allied units to a large extent. Along with this, a general change had also been experienced in the structure of the army. From Marian reforms, which we covered in earlier videos, up to the 4th century, the Roman army continued to apply the cohort system. However, as of the 4th century, a visible decline is experienced in the structuring of the army. A large majority of soldiers serving on borders resemble peasant militia forces much more than a legionnaire. These are people busy with jobs outside military service, planting and working their own fields, trading. In the late Empire period, although some laws were passed to prevent soldiers from engaging in such initiatives, these were not very effective. In addition to all this, in the 4th century, an old tradition was returned to in the Roman army. Rome's early soldiers were equipped with a specific budget paid by the state, meaning the state paid money for soldiers to buy weapons and armor. And every soldier procured his own equipment from this money to be suitable to his own choice. We had seen earlier that this practice was abolished with Marian reforms. Thus, Roman legions had begun to be equipped with standard weapons and armor provided by the state. However, by the 4th century, the empire was not powerful enough to meet existing equipment. For this reason, the old practice was revived. Soldiers had begun receiving allowances from the state again. Standard equipment of Roman legions left its place to different types of equipment, showing variation in every region. So much so that in the early 5th century before Christ, it was quite difficult to distinguish soldiers in the armies of Roman commander Stilicho and Gothic king Alaric from one another in terms of outer appearance. Over time, changes had occurred in the organization of the Roman army as well. In the 4th century, the old legions were no longer present. Roman units were divided into 3 separate subgroups, and the army was reorganized accordingly. The first group was the Comitatenses Palatini, namely the imperial army. Their primary duty was to ensure the emperor's security and protect the throne against usurper rivals. They usually moved together with the emperor and resided in cities. Their secondary roles were participating in war together with the emperor in major campaigns. The second group was the regional armies named Comitatenses. In the late Roman Empire, local administrative units were named dioceses. In a clearer expression, the empire was divided into numerous administrative units, similar to present-day governorships. Here, comitatenses were armies serving in these dioceses. They were obligated to ensure internal order and peace. They resided in a barracks inside the diocese they were tied to, and in campaign time, they joined the emperor's army. The third group was the exercitus limitanae, namely border armies. Unlike the first 2 groups, units serving on borders were rarely called to campaign. Their most important duty was protecting borders against any attack. These were Rome's stationary units. A large section of soldiers served for years in the region where they were summoned, unless there was any recall. Detecting Rome's army strength in this period is quite difficult. Some sources say the strength of soldiers used for various duties in the middle of the 3rd century was around 350,000. This number rises up to around 500 to 600,000 in the periods of Emperor Diocletian and Constantine. However, these records are misleading in many respects, for in these years, because a large number of soldiers were assigned to special duties, the number of soldiers present in the field rarely reached 100,000.